Chapter 463. In this world there were no officials who were not greedy. The only thing that mattered was whether one was greedy or greedy. The court was full of vermin, and the only thing that mattered was whether the vermin was fat or thin. If it wasn't so, why would there suddenly be a strange department called the Overwatch Council in the Qing court? Just as Fan Xian had discovered during the rectification in the first bureau, the Overwatch Council was also made up of people. Where there were people, there would be officialdom. It was impossible for the Overwatch Council to remain so cold and strict for the rest of its life. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council was not an immortal. It could not control anything above the third level. If the emperor did not issue an edict, it could not control military matters. Even if Qin Pingping and Fan Xian worked together, the Overwatch Council would not be able to change much of the current situation. In the end, the Overwatch Council was not investigating corrupt officials. It was only following the emperor's wishes to clean up the government from time to time, quell the people's anger, and make some space to maintain its rule. If it really wanted to investigate, how long would it take for the beauties in Qin Pingping's garden and the money Fan Xian had scooped up in the palace treasury to spit out, let alone the emperor sitting in the royal palace? The emperor did not need to be greedy. He was the most greedy person in the world. If he was greedy for the entire world, what could the Overwatch Council do? It was precisely because everyone was greedy that when the Overwatch Council wanted to do something because of Fan Xian's madness, it seemed to come naturally and naturally. In this dark night, the entire first bureau of the Overwatch Council moved out and headed toward the mansions in the alleys and street corners. They captured countless lower-level officials who had close ties to the second prince and Xinyang. Naturally, they could not touch anyone above the third level, but these lower-level officials were the ones the court truly needed to rely on. Everyone in Baoyue Brothel already knew of the Overwatch Council's earlier actions. They had also received Fan Xian's personal confirmation. They couldn't help but show shocked expressions on their faces. The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, fell silent. He looked deeply at Fan Xian and didn't say anything more. Although the news tonight was not clear, it could be seen that the Overwatch Council's first target was still Xinyang and the second prince's faction. They did not have deep connections with the military. Although he didn't understand why Fan Xian would suddenly use such a low-level method, the Overwatch Council's actions and Fan Xian's ruthlessness already made him feel a glimmer of fear. The beauty in the building was in his arms, killing and arresting people outside the building. Even if there was snow, how could it completely cover up the smell of blood? Not everyone sank into silence because of this sudden news. After the 5 reporting officials carefully retreated behind the screen, the great prince looked at Fan Xian with a heavy expression and asked, "Why?" The conflict between the Overwatch Council and the Xinyang faction had been going on for a long time. It began 6 years ago with the dispute over the palace treasury. It was buried in the second prince's attempt to assassinate Fan Xian on Yolan Street under the pretext of a banquet. It was also because of the story of that autumn in the Baoyue brothel where everyone was sitting. That autumn, Fan Xian took over the Baoyue house, killed Xia Baiyan and plotted against the capital government. He ruined the reputation of the second prince and Li Hongqing, the son of King Jing. He also made the Cui family in the north look like traitors. In the year after autumn, Fan Xian went to the Ming family in Jiangnan, collected the palace treasury and killed Chang Kuan in Jiaozhou. In everyone's eyes, Fan Xian's revenge against the second prince and the Xinyang faction was already severe enough, and he had reaped enough benefits. There was no reason for him to act so tyrannically again tonight. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then calmly said, "Why? Because I am under orders to investigate the governance of officials." The banquet was silent. The crown prince sat high up and did not look at Fan Xian. Instead, he looked at the second prince's expression with a difficult-to-read expression. The great prince shook his head and sighed. "There is no peace in Jingdo for more than 2 days. Why can't you all calm down a bit?" Fan Xian knew the great prince was speaking from the bottom of his heart. This current commander of the imperial army had been on good terms with the second prince since childhood. Because of Lady Ning and Wanner, he was now standing on his side. Placed in this situation, it was difficult to avoid being in a difficult position. Hearing these words, he couldn't resist sighing. "Peace? I haven't returned to the capital for a year. It looks like Jingdo has been peaceful for a whole year. Perhaps I am truly a star of misfortune. No wonder no one was willing to let me have peace in the valley outside Jingdo." The banquet was silent again. All the important figures faintly understood that this was Fan Xian finding a scene for the valley matter. However, this scene was a bit too big and absurd. There are many things in this world that are absurd. Fan Xian seemed to know what these important figures were thinking and said self-mockingly, just like the matter of me being assassinated in the valley. The court has been investigating, but because there is no evidence, they have never been able to come up with an explanation. He slowly said, "Who will pay attention to my subordinate?" As I said before, when my coachman was shot by the first arrow, I wanted to snatch him back into the carriage, but he stood up and blocked the arrow for me. I often ask myself, if I can't find any evidence, what can I do for him? The Jiangnan governor, Xue Qin, glanced meaningfully at Fan Xian. The crown prince slowly said, "Naturally, the court will investigate." This was the third time he had said these words tonight. Fan Xian nodded and smiled. It is this matter that suddenly made me think of a story I heard a long time ago. Once upon a time in the forest there was a little white rabbit. It happily left the door early in the morning. Then it met a big bad wolf. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit and slapped it twice. Slap, slap, slap. "I told you not to wear a hat." Everyone looked at each other. They didn't know why Fan Xian would suddenly tell such a childish story. They only heard Fan Xian continue, "The next day the little white rabbit put on a hat and went out again. As it walked, it met the big bad wolf again. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit again. Slap, slap. I told you to wear a hat." The little white rabbit was very depressed and ran to the tiger to complain about the big bad wolf. The tiger listened to the little white rabbit's complaint and said painfully, "Don't worry, I will uphold justice for you." Then the tiger found the big bad wolf and said, "Old wolf, this morning the little white rabbit came to complain about you. It says you keep bullying it. See if you can find another reason to beat it. For example, you can say, 'Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat.' If it finds a fat one, you can say you want a thin one. If it finds a thin one, you can say you want a fat one. That way you can beat it again. Otherwise, you can have it help you find a female rabbit. If it finds a plump one, you can say you like a slim one. If it finds a slim one, you can say you like a plump one." Fan Xian told the story very seriously, but the words he used were childish and absurd. However, everyone at the table revealed thoughtful expressions, including the crown prince and Xue Qin. They faintly understood who the tiger was referring to, but no one dared to show their expressions. Fan Xian drank a mouthful of wine and said seriously, after the old wolf heard this, he was very happy and repeatedly praised the tiger for being smart. However, their conversation was heard by the little white rabbit weeding outside the house. Very coincidental? However, stories cannot be written without coincidences. Continue. Fan Xian smiled coldly. On the third day the little white rabbit went out again and met the big bad wolf again. The big bad wolf said, "Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat." The little white rabbit said, "Do you want a fat one or a thin one?" The big bad wolf furrowed his brows and smiled. In his heart he thought, fortunately there is a second move. "Never mind, I don't want meat. Go find me a female rabbit." The little white rabbit said, "Do you like a plump one or a slim one?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly and shook his head. Meeting such a cunning rabbit, what do you think we should do? Everyone at the table also began to wonder what the big bad wolf would do next. They couldn't help but be curious as to what Fan Xian would say next. Fan Xian pressed his slightly dry lips together and smiled. The big bad wolf paused for a moment. He slapped the little white rabbit twice and scolded, "I told you not to wear a hat. I told you not to wear a hat." The most unreasonable, shameless, senseless, and nonsensical reason in the world was the most adequate reason. In other words, there was no need for a reason. What mattered was whose fist was bigger. Fan Xian finally said seriously, "I don't want to continue being a little white rabbit. I want to be a big bad wolf." This was a joke he had heard in his previous life. Speaking of it tonight, it was heavy. Everyone at the table should have roared with laughter, but at this moment no one laughed. Everyone sighed in their hearts. The matter of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley would probably never be investigated clearly. Tonight, the Overwatch Council assassinating the 8 generals, in a situation where there was no evidence and Fan Xian did not admit to it, would never be investigated clearly. The matters of the world were like this. Since they could not find sufficient reasons for their natural enmity, then what need was there to find reasons? The field of power was like a wild mountain, where wolves chased rabbits and tigers watched from the side. It was natural. Although the banquet was not broken, these major figures had long lost the will to continue. The officialdom of Jingdo had already been unable to calm down. Tonight it was even more embarrassing. Although the Overwatch Council was using the night to act and presumably would not disturb too many Jingdo people, these major figures still rushed back to their manors and yamens to deal with the aftermath. At the same time, they were mentally and officially preparing to welcome the new situation. Fan Xian walked Xueqing to the door. Before Xueqing left, he turned his head and smiled warmly. Wolves are social animals. Don't turn yourself into a lone wolf. That is always dangerous. Fan Xian's heart warmed slightly. He bowed in thanks. Xueqing was silent for a moment. He then said, although the emperor has nodded his head, you still have to watch your limits, particularly the court's face. Fan Xian once again agreed. After the carriages of the few important figures slowly left the Baoyu brothel, the crown prince stretched lazily and walked down with the beauty in his arms. There were already servants by his side who draped the expensive fur coat over his body. The crown prince glanced at Fan Xian and smiled. Tonight's show was quite entertaining. The crown prince sent away the woman beside him and the idlers around them. Looking at Fan Xian calmly, he said, speaking of which, that autumn a year ago when I saw the first half of the show you and second brother acted out, I also thought it was entertaining. Thinking about it carefully, there was nothing between you and me. Fan Xian froze slightly. He didn't know what this crown prince, who was acting very differently than usual, meant. There has never been a problem between you and me. The crown prince closed his eyes slightly and slowly said, if there is a problem, it is a problem from back then. It should not become a problem between you and me. I hope you remember this. Fan Xian understood that he and the crown prince had actually always maintained a kind of peace. However, because of the matter the empress had participated in, they had become natural enemies. He didn't understand what the crown prince was planning to do by saying this. However, Fan Xian believed that the crown prince would not watch as he killed his mother in order to fight for his support. Thus he was just saying it. No one had left, but the seat was empty. Strangely, the second prince stayed behind. He watched Fan Xian walk up from downstairs and smiled slightly. Slowly placing his left hand on the table, he did his best to suppress the absurd feeling in the depths of his heart. Using 2 fingers, he picked up a green fruit from the south and slowly chewed on it. Fan Xian sat across from him and picked up the wine pot. He began to pour and drink by himself. Suddenly he finished 10 cups. The great prince hugged the wine pot and drank heartily to the side. It was as if he wanted to get drunk. Fan Xian put down his wine cup and clapped his hands. The third prince obediently walked out from behind the curtain. He glanced at his big brother and second brother with some difficulty and then sat beside his teacher. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian disapprovingly. His eyes seemed to be saying, why drag me into the affairs of adults? In the flower hall on the 3rd floor of Baoyu brothel, there were 3 princes and Fan Xian. If one did not count the crown prince who had left earlier, the Qing emperor's bloodline in this world could be considered complete. The earlier banquet at Hongmen had become a family banquet with a strange atmosphere. You're afraid. The second prince put down the half-eaten green fruit and stared into Fan Xian's eyes as he spoke in a gentle voice. Fan Xian's hand holding the wine cup froze. He slowly replied, what am I afraid of? If you're not afraid, why did you make such a big move tonight? The second prince smiled slightly and gently said, only someone with fear in their heart would act recklessly like you did tonight. You killed my general and captured my trusted aide. Does that have any effect on the big picture? Fan Xian took a deep breath. His expression calmed. There are no outsiders here, so there is no harm in speaking frankly. Your subordinates have been cleaned out by me today, but you have no evidence. Just as I said earlier, I also have no evidence regarding the attack in the valley, but you still did it. I did not know about the attack in the valley. I did not participate. The second prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said seriously. Fan Xian shook his head. What about the Nyolan Street matter? Little White has been slapped in the face too many times. I admit that I still don't know who did it in the valley, but that doesn't stop me from taking action. He lowered his head and said, there were enemies on all sides. Since I didn't know which enemy did it, of course I had to release random arrows. If I occasionally hit the person in question, it would be an advantage for me. If I hit someone else, I would not lose out. It would be an advantage. Nyolan Street. A glimmer of bitterness flashed through the smile on the second prince's thin lips. An incident from a few years ago. Thinking about it, it was just this one incident, yet you still remember it to this day. Fan Xian raised his head and calmly said, I am a very vengeful person. As you know, this matter has little to do with vengeance. As long as you don't stop, I will continue to do it without rest. There were no officials present or the crown prince present. Fan Xian and the second prince, a pair of young nobles with similar temperaments, spoke in a very direct and straightforward manner. They were both meticulous people and knew that there was no need for too many words to hide between them. The second prince glanced deeply at the third prince beside Fan Xian and suddenly said, sometimes I feel that life is not fair. Putting aside the Chui family and the Ming family matters, just in this palace, my beloved sister has married you as your wife, and my two brothers who have been friendly with me since childhood, are now standing on your side. The second prince raised his head. There was a glimmer of hidden anger on his handsome face. If my ability is not as good as yours, then so be it. However, this is only because of some absurd reasons and stories from a previous life that created the current situation. If Father was willing to give the Overwatch Council to me, would I do worse than you? If Father was willing to give the palace treasury to me, would I not have the ability to make the treasury more abundant? Neither you nor I know how to repair the dikes. You and I can only pay silver. And G, don't you think this is very unfair? After all, I am the true prince. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He knew that his strange and varied life in the Qing kingdom and the abnormal power he was able to obtain now were all because of that woman's legacy. Of course, that woman had also brought him countless troubles and dangers. What the second prince said was not completely without reason. If he and Fan Xian had switched places, he might not have done better. It was not that the second prince did not have the ability. It was that he had never had the stage to display his ability. He slowly said, "There is no such thing as if in this world." Correct. That is why you now have the Overwatch Council in your left hand and the palace treasury in your right, the second prince said with slight mockery. Presumably only your mother once had such great power. So, you are now beginning to be afraid. Fan Xian's expression froze again. The second prince calmly said, "Have you thought about the future? Who exactly are you working hard for today?" His gaze shifted slightly and glanced at the third prince. He smiled and said, "None of the sons of the royal family are easy to deal with. You yourself are one of them. Of course you understand this." The third prince lowered his head, not daring to interrupt. Fan Xian knew that the second prince was not speaking alarmist words. He just had his own plans and plans. The second prince faintly said, "You are truly afraid. Think about it. Right now you are walking down the path of a lonely official. Regardless of who ascends the throne in the future, how can the Qing kingdom tolerate you? How can the Overwatch Council be tolerated?" Fan Xian listened calmly. The second prince continued, "The reason you are afraid is because you are a smart person. You know that although your power is monstrous, it is only a floating cloud. It is not even as sturdy as a thin piece of paper." The second prince sighed. "Because all the power in your hands was given to you by Father. With only one edict, you can be banished to the mortal world and never be able to rise again. Although Father dotes on you, it is not as if he did not guard against you. These years he has allowed you to do whatever you want, but he will not let you touch the military. I think I do not need to remind you of the deeper meaning behind this." In the end, the second prince concluded, "It is because you are afraid that you want to reduce your own power." The great prince drank a mouthful of wine and looked coldly at his two brothers talking like two fighting cocks. Fan Xian was silent for a long time and did not respond to the second prince's words. He only quietly said, "Power has always been a floating cloud. When has there ever been an undefeated general or an undestroyed clan? Your Highness is a prince. Your heart is with the world, but I am only an official. I have to protect myself and the well-being of my clan." The second prince cut off his words and coldly said, "I know that you, as a dignified immortal of poetry, have never been proud of the royal bloodline. On the contrary, you purposely avoided this point. Ask yourself honestly. If it were not for the royal bloodline that you loathe, how could you have lived until today and lived so gloriously?" Two of the four brothers were silent. Two faced each other. "Let go," the second prince said sincerely. The second prince said sincerely, "Your power is actually all illusory. You don't dare to kill me, so you can only watch as each day passes while you are in greater danger each day. Since you have already sensed this, why don't you just let go more completely? Given your reputation in the world, you are Wan'er's husband, you are Father's son, you are an honored guest of Northern Qi. Who would make things difficult for you? Who would dare to take unnecessary risks to make things difficult for you? Ling Er has said that you love to travel the world, so why are you still limited to this dangerous Jingdo and unable to free yourself?" Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. His fingers slowly gripped the wine cup and said, "Your Highness, I said earlier, my thoughts are the same as yours." He raised his head. His expression brightened. Looking at the second prince, he calmly said, "A year ago in the tea shop outside this brothel, if you don't let go, I will beat you until you let go. Reality has proven that the present me has this power. You can no longer see the 8 generals in the tea shop. This is sufficient proof." Hearing the words tea shop, the second prince's expression immediately froze. He thought of the conversation he had with Fan Xian in the tea shop outside Baoyue brothel a year ago in the autumn. At that time, the conversation had taken place between a prince and an official. After a year had passed, Fan Xian's power had expanded like a balloon. Most importantly, the two people's true identities had gradually become the same. Why should I let go? The second prince asked somewhat nervously and self-mockingly. Your Highness has been poisoned by the eldest princess. I will help you cure it. Fan Xian did not retreat. Coldly he said, my words from before still stand. When your Highness maintains a distance from the eldest princess and truly lets go, I promise you, a lifetime of peace. Based on what? The second prince looked seriously into Fan Xian's eyes. Just based on the Overwatch Council and silver? Fan Xian shook his head and said, not based on what? It is just that I owe the imperial concubine a favor and won her a promise. Your Highness should know what happened tonight. I am going to empty your Highness's personal power and beat you out of this pool of rotten water. Once the second prince thought of the great loss he had suffered tonight, he finally could no longer suppress the chill in his heart. Sinisterly he said, why me? I am not father's only son. You too. I don't have a glimmer of ambition. I am just an official, Fan Xian said. In another 2 days your Highness will know my sincerity. As for the other princes, one is my student. I will beat him more obedient. The great prince likes to drink. I will ignore the crown prince so I can only target you. You are right, this bloodline is worthy of some respect, so I will do everything I can to stop that terrifying thing from happening. The second prince's heart went cold. There was a gap in the screen that was not blocked properly. The winter wind began to drift slowly inside Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian finally said, please remember this, your Highness. The emperor is in his prime and does not wish to see such a thing happen. When Fan Xian and the emperor spoke in the palace, the emperor nodded. Perhaps no one noticed, but the storm in Jingdo was a controllable wave. Fan Xian used the opportunity of the emperor's nod to cause a stir and take advantage of it. If one said that being stupid was a kind of attitude toward life and pretending to be stupid was a kind of performance art, then being awesome was a kind of power that was backed by a mountain. Although Fan Xian's power was only a piece of paper, as long as the emperor was in his prime, this paper could cut throats. The spring and autumn of the banquet at Hongmen had finally covered the topic. Originally, I was going to talk about political correctness, friendship, and progress in history, but I could not write it out. The problem of ability. There was still a storm outside the Baoyu house. Fan Xian had written 4 strokes and inside the house there were 2. I had to write more carefully and try to write better. Today this chapter seems to have added too many words. It is over 1,000. I am too lazy to fix it. Sorry, I will make it up tomorrow. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. I support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 464. The second prince left Baoyue brothel. His expression was strangely cold. Regardless of what kind of information he had obtained in this conversation and what kind of trust and fear he had toward Fan Xian's purpose, the reality of tonight had already proven a lot. His power in the capital had already been mercilessly uprooted by Fan Xian. There were only 2 paths in front of him. One was to firmly rely on the eldest princess's side. The other was to do as Fan Xian thought and obediently withdraw from the battle for succession. Without power, what could he use to fight? The second prince knew that if the situation continued to develop like this, if Fan Xian did not sweep through his power tonight, then in the near future, the Qing kingdom would either sink into turmoil or he would be mercilessly purged. He would not feel a glimmer of gratitude toward Fan Xian because Fan Xian had forced him onto a dead end. After the great prince spoke a few words with Fan Xian, he also left Baoyue brothel with a face full of worry. At the same time he took the third prince with him. The conversation between the brothers and the royal family was not very pleasant. Since the third prince was returning to the palace as the commander of the imperial army, it was appropriate for him to take him back. The night was gradually getting darker. If there were not thick snow clouds in the sky, one would certainly be able to see that the moon had moved to where it should be in the middle of the night. Fan Xian did not leave Baoyue brothel. He sat alone for a long time and had the brothel prepare a bowl of lamb slices and clear soup. He ate it until his entire body was hot. He drank a few more cups of wine before slowly standing and walking to the window to look down. Outside the window was a deathly silence. The people of the Jingdo government and the garrison had all left. Baoyue brothel was closed for the day. The girls had also gone to bed early. Only a few clever people were left to wait on him. Inside the brothel, red candles stood silently. Fan Xian had Si Qing prepare a bucket of hot water and took a comfortable bath. After the bath, he rubbed his slightly red face and asked, "Has the great prince gone to Yangtsong Alley these 2 days?" Si Qing was listening from the side, and she knew that the big boss was talking about the Hu princess. She shook her head and prepared to help him put on his clothes, but he waved her away. Not long after, Sangwon came in. This gentle shopkeeper of the Baoyue brothel squatted down slightly and carefully put on his underwear. Her fingers slid across the surface of his well-proportioned muscles, and she couldn't help but be slightly startled. She didn't dare to move too much, and she carefully tied a hidden crossbow that was only 3 fingers wide to his left forearm. Putting on the boots and inserting the long and thin black crossbow head into the boots, Sangwon stood up and did the final tidying up of Fan Xian's clothing. She protected the black Overwatch Council robe and covered Fan Xian's skin that could be damaged by every drop of rain. Only then did she nod. Fan Xian smiled to show his appreciation. After confirming that he had not lost the pills, he patted Sangwon's head and walked out of the room. Sangwon was slightly startled. "Sir, sword?" Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the sword of the Wei Emperor in Sangwon's hand. His expression was calm, but a glimmer of confusion flashed through his eyes. A moment later he said, "This sword is too bright. It's best not to take it. Let's leave it here for now." The triple leather curtains of the Baoyue brothel were lifted open. All of the managers respectfully saw Fan Xian out the door. He had already lifted the hood from the back of his robe and put it on his head, letting the shadow cover his delicate features. Stepping down the stone steps outside the building, he couldn't resist raising his head to glance at the deep night. It was as if he wanted to confirm whether or not it would snow in a while. The carriage drove over. He shook his head, indicating that he was going to walk. He then headed east first. Baoyue brothel was having a banquet, so he did not bring the tiger guards. All of the Overwatch Council's power in Jingdo had already taken advantage of the night to carry out countless raids. Even the power of the Qinian unit had been thrown in. At this moment, there were only a few fan manor guards and a carriage driver at his side. Everyone knew about the Baoyue brothel's banquet and had heard about the commotion in Jingdo. They all thought that the young master was going to walk and think, so they didn't go forward to disturb him. They only had the carriage follow far behind. Not far after heading east, they turned and entered a straight street. Long street. Straight long street. Wearing a robe, he suddenly stopped his steps as if he was listening to something. He then waved his hand, indicating for the carriage behind him not to follow. He then walked toward the middle of the street. It was already deep into the night. A strange fog suddenly rose from the streets of Jingdo, which had stopped snowing. The fog was gradually heavier than the air. It gathered from all directions and gradually filled the long street. The slightly white fog was not very distinct on the lightless Jingdo night streets, but it effectively obstructed one's vision. It made one feel like they were blind and couldn't see their fingers in front of them. The carriage following behind did not dare let Fan Xian walk alone in the night. It was not prepared to listen to his arrangements, but it still had no choice but to stop. The fan manor guards in the carriage pulled out the infuriating lanterns a little brighter, but the dark yellow light only illuminated the fog in front. It was like the clouds above Tsang Mountain and could not see very far. They had long lost sight of the lonely figure in the black robe. On the long street, the white fog gradually thickened. Only the sound of Fan Xian's weak footsteps could be heard ringing out with a steady rhythm. Other than this, there was not a trace of sound. It was as if there were no living creatures on the street. Tonight, it seemed that the people the Overwatch Council wanted to kill had already been killed. The people they wanted to capture had already been captured and sent to prison, firmly under the 7th Bureau's control. The Jingdo people who still did not know about these things were greedy for warmth in their beds. The nobles on the night patrol had long returned home in fear. The night watchmen were slacking off, and the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards were only watching the city gates. The footsteps continued forward. They seemed to have sensed something and stopped in the white fog. A gust of winter wind blew past and thinned the fog on the long street slightly. One could faintly see the end of the long street. There shouldn't be anyone at the end of the long street, but it felt like someone was standing guard there. Wearing the robe, he stopped his steps and raised his head. His eyes calmly stared straight ahead. It was as if he wanted to see just who was there. Then he saw a person. The person's figure was tall and sturdy. His shoulders were like metal. He stood there like a mountain at the end of the long street. On his back was a longbow and a quiver. There were 13 arrows in the quiver. The wind stopped and the fog thickened. It was no longer visible. Tonight was the moment Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council launch an all-out attack on the Second Prince's faction. However, he seemed to have forgotten one thing. When your attack was at its fiercest, it was often when your defense was at its weakest. At this moment, there was no one at his side he could rely on, only himself. He was taking revenge for the attack in the valley, taking revenge without reason. He had forgotten that a certain governor was also taking revenge for the death of his only son. Could he dodge the bow in front of him? 2 years ago, he had been shot down from the palace walls by this bow and had no power to retaliate. That bow and arrow had already become the biggest blank space in his martial cultivation. Thus he stopped his steps behind the fog. On the other side of the white fog, Yan Xiaoyi lowered his eyes slightly and felt the aura of the person behind the fog to ensure that he would not break free of his control. There were no signs of movement on this side of the fog. Yan Xiaoyi, the previous commander of the Imperial Army and now the Qin Kingdom's northern governor, was one of the few 9th-level super aces in the Qin Kingdom. He was not a madman. He knew what it meant to assassinate Fan Xian on Jingdo's Long Street. However, he still did not forcefully suppress his desire for battle and bloodlust. When he saw Yan Shindu's body in the Yuantai camp, he had already made up his mind. What was the purpose of one's life? Even if he controlled all the soldiers under heaven in the future and conquered this entire land, who would he entrust it to? Thus, he was not a madman, but he was already crazy. Jingdo was not calm tonight. No one had thought that Fan Xian would carry out such a tyrannical sweep. At the same time, no one had thought that the governor of the north would abandon all his worries and return to his original hunter's thoughts. Coldly he observed Fan Xian, watched Fan Xian, waited for Fan Xian, and patiently waited for Fan Xian until he was dead. Although there was fog on Long Street that could block people's vision, it could not stop Yan Xiaoyi's arrows. His arrows did not need eyes. Tonight, he had come with 13 arrows to ask Fan Xian what the words 13th Wang on the notice in the first bureau meant. If Fan Xian died, it was fine not to ask this question. Regardless of how much Fan Xian had improved these years or how much of a genius he was in martial cultivation, Yan Xiaoyi coldly believed that he could kill him. This matter had nothing to do with the fight for the throne or the world. It was not for justice or profit. It was just that a personal grudge could not be resolved. The two of them, one on the street and one in the middle of the street, other than facing each other head-on, there was nothing else they could do. Fan Xian was silent behind the fog. It was as if he was evaluating whether he should fight or retreat. After a long silence, Yan Xiaoyi took a step forward. The murderous aura around his body caused the white fog in front of him to move, revealing an empty space in front of him. The air immediately became cold again. However, he immediately pulled his foot back. Glancing at the eaves to the upper left out of the corner of his eye, he furrowed his brows slightly and used the stone beast on the eaves to block his body. With his body and the stone beast as a line, he felt that at the end of that line, there was a strangely terrifying killing intent waiting for him. This was an unreasonable feeling. He had grown up in the woods and interacted with wild beasts. He had developed a sensitivity like a wild beast. He would always be able to judge the existence of danger ahead of time. The longbow was already in his hand, but the arrow had not been nocked. Yan Xiaoyi lowered his head slightly and felt the strange movements around him. Just who was lying in ambush? He was a powerful warrior above the 9th level. Other than those 4 strange creatures, there was not much in this world that Yan Xiaoyi needed to be afraid of. Every time his condition reached its peak, the thought of challenging a great grandmaster would always rise in his heart. It was also because of his realm that he could clearly sense that there was only him and Fan Xian on Long Street. That was why he dared to use his mind to follow Fan Xian so coldly and prepare to fire a fatal arrow at any moment. However, when he had taken that step earlier, he had discovered a strange phenomenon. The first to bear the brunt was the unknown source of danger. The second was that when he had taken that step, he had felt the smell of the fog behind him change slightly. It was the smell, not the smell. It was the slightest change in the wind and fog, not the feeling after it entered his mouth. Yan Xiaoyi knew that there had always been a powerful figure hidden behind him. He didn't know exactly what realm this person's martial cultivation had reached, but to be able to fool him for so long, he must have the ability to hurt him. He didn't move rashly because he knew that once he fired the arrow, the energy he had stored up for a long time would leak out and reveal some flaws. Once his mind was flawed, he was not confident that he could escape unscathed under the combined attack of the ace behind him and the danger in the distance. Just like this, the Long Street was icy silent. The person on the other side of the fog could not move, and Yan Xiaoyi on the other side could not move either. He could not move his feet, but he could move his hands. Yan Xiaoyi sucked in a deep breath of air. His entire figure appeared to expand slightly. His fingers slowly fell as if inadvertently brushing across his bowstring. His fingers were very thick, but this movement was very gentle. It was like a soft brush sweeping across a drawing paper, a slender finger brushing across the strings of a zither, or an orchid blooming slightly. With a light hum, the bowstring began to tremble. There seemed to be a strange magic being generated on his bowstring. The slightly trembling bowstring moved the air around it, twisting the faint white fog and gradually condensing into power. It sliced through the long street in front of him. Following this light hum, it silently attacked toward the other end of the fog. It attacked toward the person on the other end of the fog. A muffled grunt came from the other end of the fog. Immediately after, there was the sound of someone falling to the ground. Yan Xiaoyi calmly flipped his wrist. The longbow straightened. He didn't seem to move at all, but the arrow was already on the bowstring. Earlier, when he shot without an arrow, he already had such power. Now he already had an arrow on his bowstring. However, he didn't fire. He only remained silent because he could clearly tell that the person on the other end of the fog was not Fan Xian. Although he was confused, he had clearly seen Fan Xian leave Baoyue brothel. When did he switch? He understood that the roles of hunter and hunted had already changed in tonight's hunt. Yan Xiaoyi was stern and fearless. As long as the longbow was in his hand, even if 2 9th-level aces came to ambush him, he would not feel any fear. On the contrary, he felt an excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. At any moment he was ready to use the arrow on his bowstring to end a certain life. The arrow in his hand was not aimed, but his mind had already locked onto the distant place. However, the two sides were separated by the stone strange beast on the eaves of the residential buildings, so he was unable to fire. Yan Xiaoyi still had a portion of his energy on the smell of the fog behind him that had changed for an instant and had now returned to normal. No one would move first. After an indeterminable amount of time, the strange fog on Chang Street still did not dissipate. Yan Xiaoyi's mountain-like body continued to stand without a trace of exhaustion. However, he knew that the two people in the dark were also not tired. At least, they did not let him sense any relaxation in their state of mind. To be able to compete with him in patience and perseverance was a very impressive thing. Yan Xiaoyi acknowledged the other party's realm and strength. He understood that the attack on Chang Street in the middle of the night had already sunk into a stalemate. He had used the stone beast to protect himself, but it had also blocked him. If this stalemate continued, the sky would probably brighten and the two sides would still not be able to move. However, the other party could retreat, but Yan Xiaoyi could not move. He knew he had sunk into a disadvantage. Another long time passed. Yan Xiaoyi was still standing steadily in the corner of the street, like an unshakable statue. The longbow in his hand, the arrow on the string, was steady and motionless, giving off a very strange sense of beauty. Suddenly, a coughing sound came from Chang Street shrouded in white fog. Accompanying this strange coughing sound, a faint light shone into the fog. The light gradually grew brighter. As it neared the corner of the street, as it got closer, it became clear that it was 2 lanterns. The lanterns were held by 2 young eunuchs. The young eunuchs' faces were pale from the cold. Behind the young eunuchs was a small sedan carried by 4 servants. The coughing sound came from that small sedan. The sedan stopped next to Yan Xiaoyi. The curtain of the sedan was lifted slightly, revealing an old and tired face. This face belonged to Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong's murky eyes blinked. He said quietly to Yan Xiaoyi, who was next to the sedan, admiring the snowy night on the street, "Governor is in a good mood. However, it is already late. You should return to the manor. I will send you off." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support genuine reading. Chapter 465. The sedan chair slowly left Chang Street. The warrior with the longbow also disappeared with it. All that was left on the empty ground was snow and white fog. Following the departure of the sedan chair, the coughing gradually weakened. The fog on Chang Street gradually dispersed. Although it was still dark all around, it appeared much clearer than before. Snowflakes quietly fell from the sky, swaying gently and gently, as if there was a deity high up in the sky gently shaking a flowering tree. The clouds parted. A large crack suddenly appeared in the middle of the layers of dark clouds, revealing the crescent moon. The clear light gradually spread and illuminated this Chang Street clearly. The eaves of the stacked private residences behind the street that stretched into the middle of the street cast strange shadows on the ground because of the illumination of the moonlight. One of the black shadows suddenly trembled, twisting like some kind of living creature. Then, it slowly and silently retreated, shrinking back into the large mass of shadows, no longer able to be separated from it. Fan Xian lay on the corner of a building in the distance. He was wearing a snowy robe with white interspersed between black and white. He withdrew his gaze from the corner of the street blocked by the stone beasts and gently sighed, blowing out a white mist in the dark night. The threads of ice on his eyebrows cracked and shattered. Tiredly, he faced the sky and stretched out the aching muscles all over his body. His eyes stared in a daze at the crescent moon in the night sky above his head. Touching the hard chest beside him, he unconsciously shook his head and narrowed his eyes. He had put in a lot of effort tonight and had prepared sufficiently. It looked like he was about to succeed, but Eunuch Hong had broken the plan. It was truly a failure. He had not prepared to use the chest. After all, this thing was too sensitive. Until the last moment he could not use it lightly. However, if he wanted to kill Yan Xiaoyi, a warrior who already stood at the peak of humanity, he did not have much confidence without his palm touching the hard chest. This was the support of his confidence and the last thing he could rely on. Fan Xian lay in the remaining snow on the roof and took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions of failure and the anger that came from nowhere. Someone crawled over. Fan Xian lifted the snowy robe and covered the object. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. Wang Qinian moved closer to his side and said, "It's Eunuch Hong." Fan Xian nodded. "Thank you for your hard work today." Tonight, everyone in the Overwatch Council was busy with bloody matters. Fan Xian's most trusted aide, Wang Qinian, appeared to have nothing to do. Only Fan Xian knew that the mission he had given him was for Wang Qinian to keep an eye on Yan Xiaoyi's movements. He knew that Yan Xiaoyi wouldn't miss this opportunity, so he didn't want to miss it either. Moreover, Wang Qinian's performance didn't disappoint him. An expert at level 9 didn't even notice that he was under Wang Qinian's watch. The two wings of the Overwatch Council, the most adept at tracking in the world, were indeed worthy of their reputation. Wang Qinian's face was very pale, even paler than the snow on the rooftop and the silver light in the street. Following Governor Yen was undoubtedly the most terrifying task in his life. That kind of fear and pressure made this 40-year-old middle-aged man almost unable to bear it, and his mind had long reached the point of collapse. And he didn't know if he saw something he shouldn't have. Fan Xian calmly said, "I trust you. More accurately speaking, many of my things are built on my trust in you." Wang Qinian understood what these words meant. Sir Fan Jr. had bumped into him when he first entered the capital. Then, with this as the center, he began to form the Qinian unit. Through the unit, he gradually controlled the Overwatch Council in his hands. Furthermore, he was, without question, the person in the world who knew the most of Sir Fan Jr.'s secrets, such as that night after reciting poems in front of the palace, that key. The next day, news came that there was an assassin in the palace. Wang Qinian knew who the assassin was. As for the key, it was certainly used to open something. Thus, Fan Xian still hadn't killed him to silence him. Wang Qinian was surprised and moved. He was truly moved. There was an urge in his heart to die for someone who understood him. This urge was clearly very dangerous and not worth it for him, who was over 40 years old, but he still kept this beautiful feeling in his heart. From below the gate came the cry of two owls. Fan Xian tilted his ear to listen. After confirming it was clean, he made a hand gesture to Wang Qinian beside him. A glimmer of fear flashed through Wang Qinian's eyes because he had also vaguely heard of that legend. He also knew of the connection between that legend and Sir Fan Jr.'s mother. He knew that from now on, his life was completely in Sir Fan Jr.'s hands. This was the trust between them. This kind of trust in itself was a terrifying and life-threatening thing. He flipped his palm and slid down from below the gate. His sliding posture was very strange and comical. He was like a large praying mantis with long arms and legs, but he was silent. In a moment he had reached the ground and walked to the center of the street. He crouched down and checked the aura of the person in disguise. After confirming that he was still alive, he made a hand gesture toward the air. This hand gesture was for Fan Xian to see. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help smiling. Lao Wang indeed had some skill. With this Qinggong, it was no wonder that the brocade guard hadn't been able to find anything to use against him after moving around in the north for a year. The person in disguise who had been injured by Yan Xiaoyi's flux was the substitute Fan Xian had brought with him at all times when he had gone to northern Qi. Back then this substitute had helped him greatly. Today he took it out to lure the enemy. A few more strange bird cries rang out from below the gate. A few secret agents wearing black robes arrived with the Fan Manor's carriage. They picked up Wang Qinian and the substitute. All of this appeared peaceful and natural. At this moment, the clouds in the sky gathered again. The clear light disappeared. Jingdo sank back into darkness. Before dawn, when it was the darkest, snowflakes began to fall again. Fan Xian came alone to a shop in the west of the city. All of the residences were still asleep. The shops had not begun to make preparations. Even the noodle stall that had opened the earliest had not begun to prepare the minced meat. Only this shop had already opened. It used the alluring bean fragrance inside to disperse the darkness before dawn and wait for the arrival of the morning sun. Under the snowflakes, Fan Xian sat at a small table outside the shop. He held a bowl of tofu pudding in his hand and slowly drank it. The taste of the tofu pudding was not bad. There was not much bean flavor. The fragrance wafted through the nose. It was even better than what Donger made in Danzhou. This was a very natural reason. This tofu shop was the most famous in Jingdo. It was the first business the young master of Count Sinan's manor had set up after entering the capital. This tofu shop was Fan Xian's own. Fan Xian slowly drank the tofu pudding. His expression was calm, but he smiled bitterly in his heart. He had been reborn 20 years and truly was a useless second-generation ancestor. He had not brought much change to this world. The biggest change was probably the way he made tofu, right? His mother was too capable and too miraculous. In that short period of time, she had rushed to do everything that could be done. What was left for him to do? Was he going to be like all those powerful officials in history, playing with power and enjoying riches and honor, not thinking about the lives and deaths of those below him and living a muddled life? Just as he had thought about it before, worry gradually appeared on Fan Xian's face. He always felt that there was a great desire in the depths of his heart, but he still could not grasp what that desire was. He was annoyed and depressed. Thinking of the incident on the street and the longbow on Yen Xiaoyi's back, his mood dropped. F***ck. Fan Xian used a very soft voice and a very gentle attitude to curse. The fog tonight was actually not good. Although this was the environment the shadow had long determined, he had not thought that Yen Xiaoyi's state of mind would be so powerful that he could not fear the layers of fog and accurately determine his position. Furthermore, the medicine hidden in the fog seemed to have no effect on this 9th-level ultimate ace. Once one's jinqi had reached a certain depth, normal medicine was indeed not very useful. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. There was indeed no perfect thing in this world. The effect of the odorless white medicinal fog was indeed much weaker. Even so, in the murderous environment he had painstakingly created tonight, Fan Xian would still bravely try to kill Yen Xiaoyi. He was not the emperor. His confidence came from his own strength and luck that was better than anyone else's. He was not as inexplicable as the emperor. Thus, he was used to being the first to strike and eliminating all powerful figures that could threaten him. Yen Xiaoyi was the first person to bear the brunt. If there was great unrest in the Qin kingdom in the future, Fan Xian persisted. If he could weaken the other party's strength, it would be a wonderful thing for his side. Yen Xiaoyi was not in the military. Instead, he was in the capital. Furthermore, he was the first to strike. This was the best opportunity. If he allowed the other party to return to the camp on the northern expedition, it would be a pipe dream to try to kill him. Thus, Fan Xian sat at the table feeling very defeated and angry. Why had old eunuch Hong come out to break the situation? Fan Xian's right hand holding the bowl trembled slightly. He furrowed his brows and threw the bowl in his hand to the ground. The porcelain bowl shattered into countless pieces. It was rare for him to have such an uncontrollable display of anger. From this, it could be seen that old eunuch Hong's sudden appearance had indeed made him extremely angry. Why? His brows were furrowed deeply. He still couldn't understand this point. It was clear that old eunuch Hong coming out of the palace to break the situation was either the emperor's or the empress dowager's. But what exactly were the mother and son, the most powerful people in the Qin kingdom, thinking? Did they still not see the present situation clearly? If he could kill Yen Xiaoyi and had already cleaned out the second prince's power, the eldest princess's side would become increasingly weak. On the contrary, it would calm the situation of the entire royal family. Perhaps that terrifying ripple would gradually calm down. The emperor clearly knew this. Why did he nod his head and have eunuch Hong come out to stop his confrontation with Yen Xiaoyi? Could it be that the emperor was a madman who liked to see his sister step by step on the path of rebellion? A masochist? Fan Xian thought angrily. A bitter smile rose to the corners of his lips. It looked like the royal family was truly a nest of perverts. They all thought the world was too boring. But was the emperor not afraid that he would be chased down from the throne? The repeated questions, the one that had troubled Fan Xian for a long time, made his expression become somewhat ugly. What exactly was the emperor thinking? Only the emperor himself knew what he was thinking. Qin Pingping also knew. Just as Qin Pingping had said in the past, a person would have the kind of vision they would have based on the kind of position they stood in and the judgments and choices they made in accordance with their position. Presently, Jingdo was still in a fermenting stage. Fan Xian wanted to take a risk and stop this process to prevent the dough from suddenly expanding in the future. Eunuch Hong's appearance today clearly indicated that the emperor did not need Fan Xian to worry about this. Thus Fan Xian was very vexed. The first new plate of fresh tofu was brought out. It was still steaming. The worker in the tofu shop respectfully and cautiously scooped out 2 bowls. He put in white sugar, pickled mustard, sesame oil, chopped onions and soy sauce. The fragrant sweet and salty flavors were delivered to the small table and then retreated. The people in the tofu shop all knew of Sir Fan Jr.'s strange habit. This owner didn't throw away the tofu shop because it didn't make much money. He also never came in during the day to look. He would only come in every month or two at the darkest hour of the morning to order 2 bowls of tofu. Not many people knew of Fan Xian's hobby. Fan Xian was very tired tonight. He felt both mentally and physically exhausted. He used a porcelain spoon to randomly scoop up a bowl of tofu and send a mouthful into his mouth. It was sweet and very tasty. Snowflakes also fell into the bowl, making him suddenly think of shaved ice, a long-forgotten term. He felt slightly better. He shaved a few mouthfuls and suddenly seemed to recover a great deal of his energy. There was another bowl that he didn't touch. The 3 carriages broke Jingdo's peace and slowly drove to the front of the tofu shop. The swordsmen in the front and back of the carriages jumped down and vigilantly watched the surroundings, setting up defenses. Yan Bingyun lifted the curtain and walked down from the carriage in the middle. After a busy night, it was clear that Fan Xian's brain was also very tired. There was a trace of haggardness on his pale face. He walked to Fan Xian's table and was clearly surprised that Fan Xian would be eating tofu here alone. Fan Xian nodded and indicated for him to sit. At the same time he pushed the bowl of tofu mixed with chives and pickled vegetables over. Yan Bingyun didn't eat. He took out a file from his clothes and began to explain the situation tonight in a low voice. After hearing that the people he wanted to kill and the people he wanted to capture were basically in place, Fan Xian nodded his head with satisfaction. Huang Yi didn't die. Yan Bingyun glanced at him. Fan Xian raised his head and asked, "What happened?" The poison from the nails was very strong, but it seems that the Princess Manor has an expert at detoxification. Yan Bingyun said. So Huang Yi was able to keep his life. Huang Yi was the strategist of the Princess Manor. Although he hadn't caused any harm to Fan Xian and hadn't displayed any extraordinary abilities, since Fan Xian had acted, he had to eliminate all potential threats. Thus Huang Yi was also a part of the plan tonight. Fan Xian didn't want to, in the future, have a melodramatic scene of hostages being captured because of his moment of soft-heartedness. It's not an expert at detoxification. Fan Xian shook his head. I understand the methods of the brothers in the 3rd Bureau. The poison master in Dongyi is not of the same faction as us. It looks like the eldest princess infiltration into the Overwatch Council back then was very effective. Other than the dead Zhuge, she also prepared a number of detoxification pills. Yan Bingyun said, the spy buried in the Princess Manor hasn't been exposed. I acted on my own and had him withdraw. Very good. Fan Xian nodded his head approvingly. You make your own decisions on these matters. Don't let the people below take unnecessary risks. It's best if they can live. Although he said this, Fan Xian knew in his heart that this was the second failure of the night. Yan Bingyun opened his mouth again and said, the living witness you wanted to get a statement from is dead. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at him. He knew he was talking about the only living witness in the Valley attack, the Qin family's private soldier. There had never been any clues or evidence in the Valley attack case. The only hope was that living witness. Furthermore, since he was locked in the Overwatch Council's celestial prison and had the protection of the 7th and 3rd Bureau, it was impossible for him to die like this. He forcefully suppressed the strange emotion in his heart and glanced at Yan Bingyun with a not-quite-there smile. Strangely, he didn't fly into a rage. Just now Eunuch Hong came, Fan Xian said to Yan Bingyun. What do you think? Yan Bingyun was slightly startled. A moment later he quietly said, First, the master feels that you crossed the line tonight. Second, regardless of whether he or you die, the master doesn't want to see it. Don't talk about the master. I'll think of the old cripple's hateful tone, Fan Xian said with a furrowed brows. Yan Bingyun smiled and changed the subject. Although the emperor has given his nod, you took the opportunity to make such a big deal out of it tonight. In tomorrow's court conference, the council will certainly be attacked by a group of officials. I'm afraid that Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar will both speak. Under this kind of pressure, the emperor will have a certain attitude. You'd better be prepared. What are you afraid of? Fan Xian glanced at Sir Yen Jr.'s pale face and said self-mockingly, the emperor has long wanted to reduce the Overwatch Council's power. Didn't this give him a good opportunity? If I didn't know this, I wouldn't have rushed to attack everywhere tonight. Before reducing power, I have to wipe out some of the enemies. With a clang, he threw the spoon into the slightly cold porcelain bowl. His face was like frost. Tonight, I didn't do a single thing I truly wanted to do. What a great loss. Yen Bingyun said, in a few hours it will be the court conference. You have to go to court to report on your work. Prepare to be demoted by the emperor. Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly said, a few days ago the emperor had you young officials enter the palace. His intentions were clear. However, how could those old people be willing to give up their positions? Tonight, the Overwatch Council conducted a large-scale investigation. Even if we will be punished afterward, some of those unclean people will have to step down. The court will have to make some space so that the emperor can place people in. We are working for the emperor, so he will have to owe us a favor. Yen Bingyun furrowed his brows slightly. It was still difficult for him to get used to Fan Xian calling the emperor like this. He was also displeased, so he could only maintain a suitable silence. Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to look at his expression. Minding his own business, he quietly said, tonight's matter is pretty much over. I just feel a bit regretful that the family I've been waiting for still hasn't made a move. Yen Bingyun knew which family he was talking about, but he pretended not to know. For a moment, his expression was hesitant. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and said, do you think it's not lively enough? You don't have anyone by your side right now. You have to be careful of your safety. Fan Xian glanced at the Overwatch Council swordsmen scattered around and shook his head. I'm different from you. You have to bring these people. As for me, whether I bring them or not, it doesn't make much of a difference. If I brought people, how could those people dare to make a move? They're all a group of cowards who only know how to kill people in the dark, Fan Xian said mockingly. Fan Xian said mockingly, I've been sitting alone in this shop for an hour, but no one has come. It makes me look down on the so-called Iron Blood Army. Yen Bingyun shook his head and was speechless. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at a small alley in the darkness. Using his finger to knock on the table beside the tofu bowl, he said, eat it. It doesn't taste good when it's cold. In a small alley some distance from Fan's tofu shop, there were 7 people dressed in black moving corpses onto carriages. Blood slowly dripped down from the carriages and landed on the snow, giving off a faint stench. The 3 corpses had been chopped into a dozen large pieces of meat. It was clearly the terrifying damage caused by a long knife. The leader of the 7 night walkers sat in the driver's seat. Glancing at the faint light of the tofu shop in the distance, he used the reins to rub the slightly itchy calluses between his thumb and forefinger. Opening his mouth into a smile, he said in a quiet voice, young master, eat slowly. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 466. Early in the morning, Fan Xian returned to his manor and changed his clothes. After giving a few orders, he sat in the carriage outside the royal palace. By the time he arrived, the area by the palace doors was already unusually lively. Officials were gathered in groups of 2 or 3 and whispering about something. He lifted the curtain to take a look and couldn't help but shake his head. It looked like last night's story had already become today's gossip. He was the center of the officials' discussion. He had not slept all night and had been tossed about so many things. It was inevitable that his spirit was fatigued. He accepted a towel soaked in ice water from Teng Zijing's hand and rubbed it hard on his face. The skin on his face hurt as if it had been pierced by needles. His spirit finally woke up a little. He yawned, stretched, and exhaled a few mouthfuls of murky air before getting out of the carriage. As he walked along the bricks of the square in front of the palace, he attracted countless gazes and discussions. Everyone was looking at the commissioner of the Overwatch Council dressed in official robes. This was Fan Xian's first court meeting since becoming the Jiangnan Road Imperial Envoy. Logically speaking, the officials in front of the palace should have come forward to exchange pleasantries and greetings. For some reason, the officials' eyes were filled with wariness. They only watched from a distance and did not come closer. In reality, the reason was simple. Last night, the Overwatch Council had killed and arrested people. Although the people they arrested were all low-ranking officials, there were too many people. No one knew how many court officials were involved. Although these officials were shocked, they were immediately surrounded by anger. In today's court meeting, they were certain to report Fan Xian. Since it was so, it was not good for them to come forward and greet him. Fan Xian left in a bad mood. He felt that he was about to become a lonely official who was spurned by the civil and military officials of the court. Although this was his own doing, this feeling of being ignored was like being boycotted by little girls in kindergarten. He was filled with grievance. His face did not show it. He continued to smile calmly and warmly as if he did not feel the fiery gazes. When he walked to the palace doors, the guards and eunuchs guarding the doors greeted him. Fan Xian looked at the two eunuchs' ingratiating gazes and felt his heart warm and comforted. He thought to himself that in this world, it was indeed the handicapped who were more caring. Tilting his head, he saw that the two leaders of the civil officials were pointing their noses at the sky, as if they were observing the sky to see if there was anything unusual. Fan Xian rubbed his nose. He was familiar with the white-bearded old man on the left. He also knew that the middle-aged man on the right was certainly the initiator of the literary reform movement, Hu the scholar. Seeing these two overseers of the Hall of Governmental Affairs treat him so coldly, Fan Xian knew that he had made too much of a ruckus last night. In the eyes of these people, he was already leaning toward becoming a powerful and treacherous official. Additionally, the Overwatch Council's abnormal actions had indeed created a bad influence on court politics. These two leaders of the civil officials would not be too close to him, the head of the Secret Service. But he didn't buy it. Forcefully suppressing the resentment in his heart, he moved closer with a mischievous smile on his face and stood next to the scholars Shu and Hu. He didn't say anything and instead raised his head to look at the sky in a strange manner. For a moment, the officials waiting to go into court saw a strange sight. The two scholars, as well as the wretched commissioner of the Overwatch Council, all had their necks straight and heads tilted up. They looked endlessly at the layers of black clouds in the sky but did not say anything. They were only silent. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, it was finally the easygoing Shu the scholar who couldn't bear it anymore. With a cold huff he said, "What is Sir Fan Jr. looking at?" Hu the scholar also pulled back his gaze from the sky. Although the two scholars were clever people, they were not as thick-skinned as Fan Xian. They could not endure too many people's strange gazes. He coughed and didn't say anything. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Whatever you two are looking at, I am looking at." Shu Wu furrowed his brows and looked at him, wanting to say something but then hesitating. After enduring for a moment, he still couldn't hold back the anger in his heart. He opened his mouth to reprimand, "Do you know that because the Overwatch Council has power, it has to act carefully and safely? Putting aside what your intentions are, just driving around Jingdo like a tiger or a wolf, how will the officials behave? How will the court act? You don't want the face of the world's gentry but the court wants it. Tell me. You've captured so many yamen of the 6 ministries, how will they act? Putting aside how to act, the officials' hearts are all cold. How foolish. How foolish." It was fine if he didn't say it, but once he did, he couldn't stop. On the contrary, it was Hu the scholar who gave Shu Wu a meaningful glance. Only then did Shu Wu stop. However, he still felt bitter and hateful. He couldn't control his anger. Presently, Fan Xian was no longer just a teacher in the Imperial College. He was also no longer an empty prince consort who could only roll around in Honglu Temple. Although the rank of the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was not high, he was, after all, an imperial envoy. Although Shu the scholar was now the head of the civil officials, it was still inexcusable for him to scold an imperial envoy so haughtily. "Stop scolding," Fan Xian said with a smile. Fan Xian laughed and said, "No matter what, you are still an elder. To be so fierce to my nephew, it does not look good to the officials below." Shu Wu was furious, but he couldn't scold Fan Xian's tired but respectful face. He huffed hatefully and swept his sleeve. "In the court conference today, just wait for me to report you." Fan Xian's face was bitter. He raised his hands in greeting and said, "As expected. Elder, please take care of me." Shu Wu was angry and also wanted to laugh. Coincidentally, the palace doors opened. With the crack of a whip, ceremonial music began to play. Ian Hu the scholar walked in first. It was a court conference. There were many more officials in court than usual. Even so, given Fan Xian's official rank, it was still not enough for him to line up in court. However, he now had the identity of Jiangnan Road Imperial Envoy and was going to the palace to report on his work, so he did not need the emperor's special edict. However, entering the palace also needed to be lined up, so Fan Xian could only be at the back. As he stood at the palace gate, a cold and sinister aura seeped out, making the officials who walked past him feel a chill. Earlier, when there were a lot of people, they could still tie together and ignore Fan Xian. Now they were walking into the palace in pairs. The officials estimated that their status was far from Shu the scholars. They calculated the emperor's favor Fan Xian carried and thought of Fan Xian's methods. They had no other choice. They could only quietly greet him each time they passed him. Toward Sir Fan Jr., whom they had not seen in a year, these officials did not dare to be too disrespectful. Sir Fan Jr., I trust you have been well? Greetings, Commissioner Fan. Fan Xian smiled and responded to each of them. Although he knew that he would lose face because of these people in the court conference, the vanity of being bowed in order by the officials at the palace doors was not bad. He had to make the best use of this time to gain some benefits in terms of face. He had gained the benefits in terms of face, but what he got in the palace was only sour fruit. Fan Xian stood at the very back of the line and secretly sized up the emperor on the dragon chair with a slanted glance. A wave of tiredness surged through him. Looking at the emperor's calm and spirited expression, he felt a belly full of anger. He thought to himself, you sleep peacefully, but I'm about to die of exhaustion from doing things for you. Just as everyone had expected, once the court conference began, before everything had been properly arranged and the governors of the three roads standing below Shu and who the scholars had time to present memorials, the battle of memorials targeting Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council's actions last night suddenly began. Fan Xian did not listen to the specific contents of the memorials. It was nothing more than the old words Shu Wu had once said. The Overwatch Council did indeed have the duty of supervising the governance of officials, but it had been many years since an action like his, where he had captured over 30 officials in one night, had taken place. It could truly be said to have shaken the court. He looked at the governors of the three roads and was not surprised to see Xueqing at the top. The Qin kingdom's territory was large, and there were 4 governors in remote areas who returned to the capital every 2 years. He wondered with some curiosity. Last night, Xueqing had been watching by imperial edict in Baoyue brothel. Logically speaking, he should have entered the palace that night to report to the emperor. He wondered what the emperor thought of him. Fan Xian was truly tired, so his mind wandered completely. However, there were many things he could not hear even if he did not want to hear. The attacking words of the entire court continued to surge endlessly into his ears. Gradually, the crimes began to grow, such as looking down on the court, disrespecting morals, using national weapons for private purposes, forming a clique, and so on. In the Qin court, the Overwatch Council and the system of civil officials had always been sworn enemies. Regardless of what faction the civil officials had, when faced with the Overwatch Council, they were always united. From when Prime Minister Lin was there to now when the scholars were at the head, as long as the Overwatch Council, the Emperor's secret organization, overstepped its bounds, the system of civil officials would band together and carry out the most powerful counterattack. Without question, Fan Xian had overstepped his bounds last night. Thus, today's court conference became the battlefield where he was attacked. What was different from previous years was that the military, which had always had a close relationship with the Overwatch Council, no longer maintained its silence. On the contrary, the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs also stood out and secretly expressed their dissatisfaction with the Overwatch Council's actions. Even the emperor himself probably did not want to endure this kind of pressure, much less Fan Xian, who stood alone at the end of the line. The atmosphere in Taiji Palace was no longer oppressive. On the contrary, it was filled with a kind of irritation unique to winter. With Shu Wu in the lead, the officials all went up to ask the emperor to restrain the Overwatch Council and at the same time make a final judgment on this matter. One after another, their words pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart and wounded his spirit. Slanderous water flew in all directions. If it had been any other official in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have long lost their minds in anger and jumped out to debate with the officials. At the same time, they would gather their remaining courage and pull out the beards of the imperial censoriate's imperial censors. However, Fan Xian still forcefully maintained his calm. He didn't say a word or defend himself. He only tilted the corners of his lips slightly, carrying a glimmer of a mocking smile as he watched the stage of the court conference. Perhaps it was the smile at the corners of his lips that made someone uncomfortable to look at. It made someone feel that his son was too impetuous and arrogant. An angry rebuke came from the dragon chair. Fan Xian, do you have nothing to say? Fan Xian had been forcefully pushing away his drowsiness. Suddenly hearing these words, he shivered. Tidying his official robes, he stepped out and bowed. Your Majesty, last night, the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council summoned 32 officials for questioning. Everything was done according to Qing law and edict. There was nothing that went beyond the rules. Thus, I do not understand why everyone is so agitated. The emperor smiled coldly and said, "You captured 32 people in one night. You sure are arrogant. Is the Qing court full of corrupt officials?" Fan Xian said seriously, "I dare not deceive your Majesty. In court." He gazed at the officials in the palace and said seriously, "Vermin crawl all over the ground. 32 people is only a small number. If your Majesty grants the Overwatch Council a special edict, I will certainly be able to capture more corrupt officials." The officials' hearts chilled. Immediately, disdain rose to their faces. They thought to themselves, "What are you talking about? What is the court? The court is the officials. There are no officials in this world who are not corrupt. If you capture them all, who will govern the world on behalf of the emperor and protect the people? How could the emperor give you a special edict?" As expected, the emperor flew into a rage and gave Fan Xian a thorough scolding. It was nothing more than not seeing the big picture, acting recklessly, and sullying the emperor's heart. Fan Xian was unhappy. Although he knew it was an act, he was still unhappy. He resentfully returned to the ranks. In the court conference, no one brought up the death of the second prince's 8 family generals, the death of Governor Yan's only son, and the eldest princess strategist Huang Yi being poisoned and vomiting blood in bed. Those people were not officials. Furthermore, it was a matter of the dark. No one would be so stupid. However, just the events of last night were enough to arouse the wariness and anger of the civil and military officials. Thus, even the emperor had to appease them. However, the emperor sitting on the dragon chair only coldly said, "Concerning the assassination attempt on Fan Xian in the outskirts of the capital, how is the investigation going?" The officials were silent. The official of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Justice stepped out with trembling bodies and repeatedly begged for forgiveness. Fan Xian had no choice but to step out and beg for forgiveness. After all, the Overwatch Council was part of the Joint Investigation Division. However, this matter was absurd. He had been assassinated, but he had not found out, yet he had to beg for forgiveness. The emperor looked at Fan Xian and furrowed his brows. "I heard that the last witness died in the celestial prison last night. Is this true?" Fan Xian was stunned. He had not thought that the emperor's news would come so quickly. On the other side, the faces of the Wu officials revealed a deeply hidden joy and smile. They were waiting to see how Fan Xian would explain this matter. The emperor did not need too much explanation. All of the preparation work had already been done. The emperor was decisive. He issued the edict he had been preparing for a few days. The first part of the edict made all the civil and military officials feel a sense of disbelief because the emperor had reduced the power of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council's rank did not drop, but its power was greatly restricted, particularly the first bureau stationed in Jingdo. Although it still had the power to arrest people, it had made detailed rules on the time limit after an arrest. In particular, the transfer of prisoners to and from the Supreme Court had to be completed within 48 hours. In other words, the First Bureau no longer had the power to secretly interrogate officials in the capital. At the same time, the edict made a general limit on the power of the Fourth Bureau stationed in each province. As for the specific rules, Fan Xian would have to return to the council to draw up a draft and then submit it to the court for discussion. These 2 changes appeared small, but in reality, it was like a timer had been placed on the Overwatch Council. It made it inconvenient for them to do things in the future. Fan Xian listened to the edict. He felt disgusted like he had eaten a fly, but he still had to step out and give thanks. The civil and military officials were pleasantly surprised. At most, they had wanted the emperor to issue an edict to demote Fan Xian and at the same time, slightly restrain the Overwatch Council and give the subordinates who had been innocently arrested a chance to live. They had not expected that the emperor would actually take action against the Overwatch Council. If this trend continued, the Overwatch Council's power would gradually be whittled away. Thus, cries of "Long live the emperor" filled Taiji Palace. The officials secretly thought that the emperor was indeed wise. However, the second part of the emperor's edict made the civil and military officials feel that although the emperor was wise, he was still too protective of his own people. The edict made it clear that the officials who had been arrested last night were not limited by the previous rules. They would all be handed over to the Overwatch Council to interrogate and then handed over to the Supreme Court to convict and interrogate. At the same time, the emperor used this matter to fly into a rage. He angrily rebuked the officials in the palace for not being strict with their subordinates and letting down the grace of the country. They only knew how to form cliques for personal gain and were shameless. Once the edict came down, the officials were terrified and didn't know what to do. Because the investigation of the attack in the valley was not done well, the Jingdo guards were treated as empty, and the case of corruption among the officials in the capital, the right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, was demoted. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, Qin Heng, was removed and replaced by the deputy general of the Western Expedition Army. Qin Heng was transferred into the Bureau of Military Affairs. At the same time, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice was replaced, the deputy of the Supreme Court was replaced, and the imperial censor writing in the imperial censor was replaced. The replacements were all the young officials who had entered the palace a few days ago. The officials paled in shock. The emperor's lightning-fast methods truly caught everyone off guard. If it weren't for the recent conflicts in Jingdo, such a large-scale change of blood would not have proceeded so smoothly. Everyone knew that the matter was not over yet. They couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the young man at the back of the line. A complicated emotion welled up in their hearts. Only now did they understand that Sir Fan Jr.'s sinister actions last night were just foreshadowing the edict in today's court conference. It has been very busy recently. The timing of the updates has been a bit unstable. I will report to everyone in the future. I wish everyone a happy weekend. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 467. Once the edict came down, the officials were in an uproar. Although the leaders of the various departments had not changed positions, there were more young officials at their side. They couldn't help but feel a glimmer of fear. Who knew when the emperor would raise up those young officials to replace them, these old people? Shu the scholar furrowed his brows and stepped out. He argued with the emperor for a bit. He felt that such a large-scale appointment of officials without going through court deliberations or having the Ministry of Appointments and Overwatch Council examine it first was truly too rushed. However, the emperor had made up his mind and did not even give him face. He lightly refuted it. This imperial edict became a matter that was set in stone. A change of blood was already inevitable. Qin Heng had been moved to the Bureau of Military Affairs. His rank appeared to have increased, but in reality he had left the vital area of the Jingdo garrison. He was somewhat stunned, but he could only step out and thank the emperor. Other important figures like the previous deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, could only helplessly accept this suggestion. The emperor did not look deeply into the matter of the attack in the valley. Otherwise, the military would certainly have to pay a greater price. However, the gazes with which the military generals looked at Fan Xian became increasingly angry. Everyone knew that among the civil and military factions, the emperor had adjusted the Bureau of Military Affairs and the Jingdo garrison to support Fan Xian and vent his anger for the attack in the valley. As for what other follow-up actions there would be after the court was dismissed, they would have to wait quietly. However, the military's days were not going to be easy. Among the civil officials, the largest number of officials had been replaced. Basically, they were all officials close to the Second Prince's faction. What was particularly terrifying was that it seemed that the 32 officials Fan Xian had captured last night would not have a chance to come out again. Fan Xian listened carefully to the edict. It was clear that the emperor had prepared this edict last night. After listening for a long time, he was surprised that he did not hear Yan Bingyun's name. However, thinking about it, it made sense. Even if the emperor wanted to put Yan Bingyun in an important position, he would not move him to another department. Putting aside the fact that this was against Qing law and the Overwatch Council's rules, if the emperor wanted to use Yan Bingyun, he would have to give Qin Pingping some face. As for Sir Yan Jr. being promoted, it was also impossible. If he was promoted again, he could only take Fan Xian's commissioner position. Fan Xian shook his head and thought to himself that unless the emperor was prepared to single-handedly flip the Overwatch Council over, he would not do such a thing. But Fan Xian was surprised to hear Qing Jialin's name. He tilted his head slightly and resisted the urge to look at the middle-aged man on the dragon chair. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. Jialin was his student and was now an official far away in a foreign land. How had he fallen into the emperor's eyes? And, to the Ministry of Personnel? The department that he had been unable to interfere with, had been promoted twice in one go. This kind of promotion speed was too fast. When the officials of the court heard Qing Jialin's name, they couldn't help but be shocked. Everyone knew that he was one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. He had only been an official for 2 years. Why was he being transferred back to Jingdo? Everyone turned their gazes toward Fan Xian, their gazes filled with caution and fear. Fan Xian felt a bit uncomfortable. The favor the emperor had given him was too great. According to his habits, after giving a sweet date there would be a stick. He didn't know where the stick would land. Shen Chongwen has been transferred to the Imperial Censorate to be an Imperial Censor. He has ordered the Imperial Censor of the Left, He Zongwei, to oversee Overwatch Council matters and assist Fan Xian in his actions. He is responsible to the internal court. The stick came really fast. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head. A dim light flashed through his eyes as he glanced at the young man who had stepped out to give thanks. The Imperial Censor of the Left had entered the manor? Although the Overwatch Council had always been under the supervision of the internal court in name, the Qing royal family had always strictly prohibited eunuchs from holding power. Additionally, Qin Pingping was too powerful, so the Overwatch Council was like an independent kingdom. To have the Imperial Censor of the Left keep an eye on the Overwatch Council and report to the internal court at the same time was putting the Overwatch Council directly under the gaze of the royal palace. Fan Xian's back felt a chill. The fingers on his right hand trembled slightly. He knew that because of his identity, the emperor would not trust him as much as he trusted Qin Pingping. However, he had not thought that the emperor would act so ruthlessly. Before the matter had even concluded, he had already put a rope around his head and pricked it until it hurt. Who was He Zongwei? He was a Jingdo talent who had once been as famous as his student, Ho Jichang. He was one of his sister Ruoruo's pursuers. He had first been under the crown prince and then the eldest princess. Now he had become the emperor's student. Without going through the imperial examinations, he was directly selected into the court as an imperial censor. Because of his meritorious service, he had become the Imperial Censor of the Left and was responsible for investigating the Ministry of Revenue case. Not including Fan Xian, He Zongwei was definitely the most popular figure in the Qing court these 2 years. Yet, such a disgusting person like Fan Xian was going to become the emperor's eyes watching the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian grew angry for no reason. He was unusually angry. Your Majesty. Fan Xian stepped out of the ranks and stood by He Zongwei's side. Facing the man on the dragon chair, he said in a low voice, I have an objection. He Zongwei glanced warmly at Fan Xian beside him. Although each time he thought of being beaten by the other party in Fan Manor, he felt an incomparable anger in the depths of his heart, he still hid it well. His eyes revealed just the right amount of strangeness and admiration. It was as if he was expressing his emotions to the officials in the palace. He admired Sir Fan Jr. for daring to talk back to the emperor. The palace was already in an uproar. The emperor had an order and the officials had to accept it. Other than old people like Xu Wu who dared to talk back to the emperor, no one had ever directly expressed their objection and resentment on the appointment of an official. The emperor furrowed his brows and said, What objection do you have? Fan Xian raised his head and said expressionlessly, The Overwatch Council does not need an imperial censor to point fingers. How dare you? The emperor slapped the dragon chair and said angrily, The law enforcement is at the side and the imperial censor is at the back. The laws of the country are clear. My decision has been made. How can I allow you to speak so much? Anger rose in Fan Xian's heart. He knew he could not retreat anymore. Otherwise, if the Overwatch Council really fell at his hands, how would he explain it to that woman and the old cripple in Qin Garden? He straightened his body and straightforwardly said, May I ask, Your Majesty, the Overwatch Council is responsible for supervising the governance of officials? It is overseen by the internal court, the Overwatch Council. Suddenly there is an imperial censor. If this imperial censor is corrupt and breaks the law, should the council investigate or not? If we are to investigate, how? The officials clamored. On the contrary, the emperor laughed coldly and said, You have been clever your whole life, yet you are pretending to be confused. Go back. At Fan Xian's side, He Zongwei also insincerely tried to persuade him, but Fan Xian couldn't even be bothered to look him in the eye. He also didn't retreat. His eyes spun a few times and suddenly said in a loud voice, I object. This was a bit over the line. When the emperor decided on something, how could he, an official, object? This was not a lawsuit in court. Fan Xian, you are not Song Shiren, and the emperor is not a little prefectural magistrate. The emperor's anger was not kind. The beard on his chin trembled wildly. Pointing down at Fan Xian's nose, he scolded, I want to see how you object. Fan Xian steeled his heart and said, Naturally, I do not dare to object. However, I am only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. The director is still in Qin Garden. Logically speaking, it is not my place to discuss this edict. However, I am the head of the Overwatch Council today. Whether I accept it or not, it is also a problem. Looks like I can only resign as Commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Your Majesty, directly send an edict to the Overwatch Council. Resign as Commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Resign? The officials were in an uproar. They had no idea how the court conference had developed into such a situation. They had thought that the Emperor was using the Overwatch Council to clean up the court. How come, in the end, he was bullying Sir Fan Jr.? However, Sir Fan Jr. was indeed worthy of being an immortal poet. The pride in his bones was indeed not something normal people could compare to. He dared to use resignation as a threat in the court conference to not accept the edict. Since the founding of the Qing Kingdom, these officials had never seen such daring. For a moment, the sound of discussion rose in the palace. Other than the initial fear in their gazes toward Fan Xian, who was standing in the center, they couldn't help but have a glimmer of absurdity and admiration. Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar could not continue watching. They both stepped out, one playing the bad cop and the other playing the good cop. Shu the scholar scolded Fan Xian, saying that he did not know his duty as an official and spoke nonsense. Hu the scholar stood by Fan Xian's side and comforted him, explaining the emperor's edict in detail. In any case, Fan Xian just stood straight and refused to accept the edict. He also refused to do anything. This scene looked like a kindergarten student who had lost fruit on his lunch plate and was being tricked by two teachers. Shu and Hu the scholars then turned to beg for forgiveness on Fan Xian's behalf, saying how Sir Fan Jr. was young and so on. They guessed that it was rare for the emperor to encounter such a big nail in court. He was probably about to go crazy with anger. On the dragon chair, the emperor laughed angrily. A cold light shone in his eyes. Coldly, he said, "Fan Xian, are you going to use resignation to threaten me?" "I don't dare." "Good, good, good." The emperor said good 3 times in a row. Faintly, he said, "You think I won't punish you just because I love you? If you want to resign, then I—" The emperor had not finished speaking when Fan Xian was moved and thanked him. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I am willing to go back to the Imperial College to teach." The emperor choked on his quick response and said angrily, "I will not let you resign." For a moment, the palace sank into a shocked silence. No one had thought that they would be able to see such an exciting show at the court conference. Everyone knew that the emperor's favor toward Fan Xian had not decreased at all. He probably would not give Fan Xian any substantial punishment. However, they didn't know how this stalemate could be broken. The officials did not understand why Fan Xian would be so angry and impulsive toward the Imperial Censorate asking about the Overwatch Council. If it was to maintain the Overwatch Council's power, given Fan Xian's methods, he had plenty of ways to do so in the future. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council still had an ancestor that had not made an appearance. It was clear that the emperor also did not know what Fan Xian was thinking. He furrowed his brows and said to Fan Xian, "Get over here." Fan Xian did not get out. He ran over with a jolt and moved closer to the dragon chair. His face was full of stubbornness and ruthlessness. The emperor lowered his voice and asked, "Are you going to accept the edict or not?" "No." The emperor furrowed his brows and said, "Why?" Fan Xian said straightforwardly, "I don't like his own way." The emperor angrily said, "Last night you already made the court lose face. Do you want me to lose face again today? Get back here." Fan Xian sighed and retreated. Eunuch Yao stood to the side with a pained expression. Holding his horsetail whisk, he suppressed a smile. It was very uncomfortable. Fan Xian retreated into the palace. The officials on both sides looked at him with strange gazes. He was actually whispering to the emperor in court. This favor was truly, cough cough. The emperor did not give Fan Xian any chance to speak. He also did not care if he accepted the edict or not. He directly nodded his head to Eunuch Yao. Eunuch Yao immediately used a duck's voice that was different from Eunuch Dai's and called out, "Jiangnan Road Plenipotentiary Imperial Envoy Fan Xian, come forward to hear the edict." Fan Xian paused. He lifted the front of his robe and knelt down. The edict spoke slowly. It did not mention the matter of the Imperial Censorate entering the Overwatch Council. Instead, it gave a general list of what Fan Xian had done this year in Jiangnan, placing particular emphasis on the matter of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. It praised Fan Xian's contributions to the national treasury and also mentioned the matter of Fan Xian helping Governor Shui Qing investigate the governance of Jiangnan officials. The emperor opened his mouth and said, "I think that Sir Fan Xian is loyal to the country and should be heavily rewarded." The officials were silent. Although no one liked Fan Xian receiving another reward, The over 10 million liang of silver the palace treasury had shipped back to Jingdo was real. Such a large and solid contribution was worthy of an enemy's contribution. If it was not heavily rewarded, the court did not know how to explain it to the people of the world. Xueqing stepped out and added to Fan Xian's Jiangnan affairs. He was full of praise. Scholar who stepped out and also thought that Sir Fan Jr. should be heavily rewarded. Xu Wu's eyes spun a few times and then glanced at Fan Xian. Finally, he couldn't resist stepping out and saying, "Your Majesty, half a year ago the Hall of Governmental Affairs had a discussion. Given Sir Fan Jr.'s reputation, knowledge, and achievements, it was truly enough for him to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters. However, Overwatch Council officials are never allowed to become court officials. The court had set the precedent. However, earlier Sir Fan Jr. had intended to resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council." The Emperor coughed. Who the scholar also couldn't resist glancing at Xu Wu with a strange gaze, thinking that this old man was indeed stubborn. He clearly knew that the Emperor would not allow Fan Xian to enter the pavilion, much less allow Fan Xian to leave the Overwatch Council. Yet he still held on to the idea the two of them had half a year ago. However, Xu Wu had already spoken, so he could only express the same wish and recommend Fan Xian to enter the pavilion. Fan Xian had heard of this matter in the council reports, but seeing it with his own eyes, he couldn't help feeling surprised. He was not even 20 years old, yet he wanted to enter the pavilion. This was a bit too absurd. As expected, the Emperor still did not allow it. He only had Eunuch Yao finish announcing the edict. After listening to the edict, Fan Xian froze where he was. A moment later he remembered to give thanks. He thought that it was indeed absurd for him to be a scholar, but the reward the Emperor gave was also absurd. The Duke of Dambois. The hall was filled with cries of surprise and praise. Fan Xian stood there in a daze, wondering how he had suddenly been made a duke. Wasn't this even higher than the old man's? The Emperor's stick was ruthless, but the size of the sweets he gave was also not small. He was only one step away from becoming a prince, an incomparably noble title. He tilted his head to glance at the awkward Hizongwei and wondered if he could casually beat him up in the future. Advertising to friends, http://mmchidian. Commonweb 1900516. SPX, colored glass beautiful demon. Thank you everyone. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 468. Fan Xian's original title was a first-rank baron, second level, while a duke was superior. In between there was still the rank of marquis. Given his present age, directly becoming a duke was truly a rare honor. Even he couldn't react for a moment. By the time the crowd reacted they understood why. On one hand, the court wanted to reward him for his service in Jiangnan. On the other hand, everyone knew that the most important reason was that the emperor wanted to compensate his illegitimate son. The great prince and second prince had long been made princes. Fan Xian was only the Duke of Dambois. What did that count for? Thinking of this, the officials who had planned to stand out and fiercely oppose this reward all fell silent. This was a family matter of the royal family, not a national matter of the court. It was not their place to speak out. After Fan Xian's joy, he immediately calmed down. For most of the people in this hall, a duke was indeed a shiny golden word. For him, the power in his hands had long exceeded this boundary. Furthermore, the emperor had not given him a greeting and had the imperial censorate squeeze into the Overwatch Council's sphere of influence. This was the problem that Fan Xian truly cared about and feared. Thus, he would rather throw away his previous description and pester endlessly than let the emperor easily stuff sand in. Furthermore, he faintly knew that the position of duke was the final destination he could reach in the Qing kingdom. Presently, the Duke of Dambois was a third-level duke. There were still 2 more levels he could climb. After that, it looked like he would have to retire at such a young age. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a bit perplexed and feel that it was absurd. He couldn't resist standing in the hall and laughing involuntarily. Everyone's attention was focused on the youngest duke since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Looking at his hateful smile, the emotions in their hearts were complicated. They felt that this laughter was incomparably ear-piercing. The court conference lasted until after lunch before it ended. This was because the official court discussions with the governors of the 3 roads had been delayed until later. The emperor cut the Gordian knot with a sharp knife. The emperor decided most of the matters alone and dismissed the officials. The officials had long been hungry. They all passed through the palace doors and returned to their manners. However, there were still some people who could not leave. The officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the governors of the 3 roads who had not returned to the capital in a long time, and the various ministers carefully followed the emperor to the royal study. Fan Xian followed at the back with a helpless expression. Just like a year ago when he returned to the Qing kingdom from northern Qi, there was still a seat left for Fan Xian in the royal study. Last time, it was because of Zhuang Mohan's carriage of books. This time, it was because of the countless snowflake silver the palace treasury had sent over. Fan Xian sat on the round embroidered stool, feeling a little uneasy. The voices in the royal study discussing national affairs did not interest him. Government affairs had never been his strong suit, and he could not come up with any ideas. In the end, he could only play the role of picking up what was missing and making up for what was lacking. It was clear that the emperor was aware of his abilities. He also did not want Fan Xian to express too many opinions on national affairs, so he did not mention his name today. However, he, the newly promoted duke, still had a place to sit. Beside the emperor's soft couch, the crown prince and the other princes still had to stand obediently and listen and learn like students. Fan Xian felt good. He thought he could be considered the teacher of his royal brothers. The emperor and various figures discussed the snow disaster in the south, the situation in the north, and the auspicious signs in the garden. Then they began to put out the food. Fan Xian had been busy all night. The lamb slices and tofu pudding had long been digested. Hearing the food being put out, he couldn't help but feel his spirits rise. A sense of happiness rose in his heart like a walk-on finally having a boxed meal. Accepting the food box the eunuch handed over, he ate without speaking and swept away everything. The main matters had already been decided at the court conference. There was nothing new in the meeting in the royal study. It was just that when Xue Qing occasionally brought up the Hangzhou Conference's excellent performance in the disaster relief matter in Jiangnan, the ministers in Jingdou expressed a glimmer of surprise. They had heard of the Hangzhou Conference, but they had not thought that the Hangzhou Conference would have such great wealth and power to be able to do so many things outside of the government's disaster relief. The emperor had Fan Xian rise to explain. Listening to Fan Xian's explanation, only then did Xu Wu and the others understand that behind the Hangzhou Conference were the ladies in the royal palace. In name, the leader was the Empress Dowager. No wonder the Hangzhou Conference had such power. However, everyone knew that the palace was only using the name of caring for the people. The one who truly did things and paid the silver was probably still Fan Xian. The emperor smiled and said, "The one who has truly worked hard is not Fan Xian. It is my Qing girl." The officials chuckled and said a few words of flattery. They even loudly praised the nobles in the palace, especially the emperor. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's slightly absent-minded face and furrowed his brows slightly. The great prince watched this scene from the side and said, "The princess is returning to the capital today." The emperor made an "oh" sound. When he looked at Fan Xian again, his gaze softened. He smiled but didn't say anything. He also didn't have Fan Xian return to the palace early. He only immediately ended the meeting in the royal study and asked Fan Xian, who wanted to return the most, to stay. The calming incense slowly floated in the royal study. Its color was not as milky as the white smoke. Its fragrance was very light. Only the emperor and Fan Xian were left in the royal study. Fan Xian felt slightly uncomfortable because he didn't know what the emperor was about to say. The emperor drank a mouthful of bird's nest and raised his head to glance at Fan Xian, indicating for him to want another mouthful. Fan Xian quickly shook his head. One cannot express one's will without tranquility. One cannot reach far. The emperor put down the bowl and slowly said, "Do not be troubled or worried, do not lose one's way. This was the explanation you gave to everyone when you opened that bookstore in Jingdou 2 years ago." Fan Xian nodded. The name of the Dambua bookstore came from this. However, Ruoruo's sister knew his intentions and was different from others. She gave the explanation of drifting in Danzhou. Thinking of this, he suddenly missed that silly girl. He didn't know if she was having a good time in the north. "I like these 2 sentences of yours very much. You should know what it means for you to be the Duke of Dambua." The emperor calmly looked at his most accomplished illegitimate child. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said seriously, "Express one's will and worry less." "Correct," the emperor calmly said. "You need to know what you should do but think less about what you can do." A pure official? A lone official? In reality, the meaning was very simple. As an official of the emperor, one should not be troubled or worried. Fan Xian didn't know what he was thinking. The smile on his face appeared very sincere and relaxed. He opened his mouth and said, "I understand." For a ruler and official to respond, The one who said he understood should be the emperor. However, Fan Xian had said it so clearly, yet it did not seem strange. The emperor also did not show any displeasure. Serving to the side, Eunuch Yao's face was calm. During these 2 years, he had grown used to the emperor's treatment of Fan Xian being different. The emperor waved his hand. Eunuch Yao bowed and left the royal study. After a moment of silence, the emperor coldly said, "As for the matter of the imperial censor entering the Overwatch Council, you will understand in the future. I know your heart is good. However, the matters of court cannot be changed by the hearts of people." Fan Xian knew that there were not many people here, so he couldn't make a scene or act spoiled or forcefully resist. He could only remain silent. The emperor then slowly said, "It's still the same words. I know your heart. That is why I am very happy about what happened last night. However, I never thought you would be so forceful. It was a bit unexpected." Fan Xian's throat was a bit dry. After thinking for a moment, he replied solemnly, "The river has not burst its banks. I will first lead the water away to prevent the people from suffering." The emperor looked at Fan Xian's face and didn't say anything. After a long time, he nodded his head in relief. "However, have you thought about it? You have sucked out all the water, but there will be flowing water in the future. Who knows whether or not the water will once again overflow the banks. Thus, I thought that I would have to keep watching until the day the mountains collapse and the earth cave in. Only then would I know whether or not the water in the river will flow downstream or shamelessly break through my great banks. Child, you pretend to be fierce on the surface, but there is always a soft spot in your heart." The emperor's face became cold. He continued, "In my life I only desire 2 things. The world and the inheritance. If I don't see their hearts clearly, how can I let go and conquer the world? Don't move any more and watch with me." Fan Xian was silent and vigilant, not daring to reply. The emperor's first words were full of warning. The Duke of Dambua could forever only be a duke. Yet, he wanted him to keep watching with him and also wanted him to maintain his calm and not attack the second prince and crown prince's faction. This was another promise of a lifetime of glory and supreme trust. Also, don't waste time with Xiaoyi. The emperor stared into his eyes and said, "Xiaoyi has done a great service to the country and is a fierce general in the military. I don't want him to fall in these matters." Fan Xian froze slightly. He thought to himself that he and Governor Yan had formed an irreconcilable enmity. How could this be resolved? Besides, even if Yan Xiaoyi had done a great service to the country, his relationship with the eldest princess was too deep. Was the emperor not afraid at all? He finally confirmed that the person who had sent Eunuch Hong to break the situation last night was not the Empress Dowager but the emperor himself. He grew increasingly confused. In the martial conference, what if the governor challenges me? He glanced at the emperor and asked worriedly. The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. If Yan Xiaoyi challenged Fan Xian in the palace, the emperor could not say something like that in front of all the officials that Fan Xian was a prince and could not be harmed. Yan Xiaoyi will leave before the martial conference, the emperor said. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "But the governor put his son's death on my account." The emperor glanced at him with a not quite there smile and said, "Did you kill him?" Fan Xian replied sincerely, "This matter indeed has nothing to do with me. I wouldn't dare to secretly kill the son of an official." The emperor laughed loudly. What a good wouldn't dare to secretly kill. Were the killings last night open killings? Fan Xian's face reddened and he said, "The ones who moved last night were all Jianghu people. It has nothing to do with the court." The emperor was silent for a moment and then said, "The ones who moved in Yuantai camp were people from Dongyi, so I am curious as to whether or not there would be any problems over there. I want to see if Xiaoyi is a smart person." Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he was crying bitterly in his heart. 13th Wang, you've even tricked the emperor." It was clear that the emperor had made an incorrect judgment because of this wrong source of information. Yet Fan Xian could not, no matter what, warn him. As for Xiaoyi's problem, I must remind you that the military cannot fall into chaos. The emperor's gaze became deep and serene. He opened his mouth to sigh and said, "The Hu chieftains in the west are making trouble again." The Hu people in the west were making trouble? Fan Xian raised his head in shock and looked at the emperor's slightly worried face. For a moment he was so shocked he didn't know what to say. 20 years ago, the emperor had led an army on an expedition to the west and had already killed the people of Shihu to the point of desolation. In addition, a few years ago, the great prince had led an army to sweep through the west. Why were the Hu people making trouble again? Furthermore, even if they did, given the strength of the Qing kingdom's military and the number of generals, The emperor would not be worried about the instability of military morale because of foreign aggression. Fan Xian had grown up in the Qing kingdom. He knew that when the Qing kingdom was first founded, it had been bullied and humiliated by Shi Hu for a number of years. The Hu people had always been a great threat to the Qing kingdom. It was only during these 20 years, under the powerful suppression of the Qing emperor, that they had become disdainful of becoming a topic of conversation among the Qing people. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's shocked expression and smiled mockingly. The Qing kingdom has suffered disasters year after year. Droughts and floods add to each other and snowstorms arrive. Coincidentally, Shi Hu has had good weather these 2 years. The grass grows and the horses are fat. Of course, if that was all, the mere Hu barbarians would not make me so careful. However, did you know that before the Qing kingdom's snowstorm, the snowy barbarians to the north of northern Qi also suffered their biggest frost disaster in decades? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly thought of the matter Haitang Duo had once worriedly mentioned to him by the lake in Hangzhou half a year ago. Those northern barbarians had indeed suffered from a snowstorm. Countless cattle, sheep and horses had frozen to death. However, the northern barbarians and Shi Hu were very far apart. What did this have to do with the Qing kingdom? The emperor said, "No wonder the northern Qi royal family dared to keep Shangshanhu in Shangjing and not worry about the northern barbarians coming south. Heaven is helping them. Those northern barbarians were frozen to death. Yet, because of Shangshanhu's many years of power, they did not dare to take the risk of going south. They could only go around the Chilean mountains in hopes of finding a way to survive. The Hu people live by water and grass. After half a year of migration, the northern barbarians have finally reached the territory of Shi Hu. Although only 40,000 of the 200,000 tribes survived, those who survived in the wind and snow and on the dangerous path are all elites." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. It was as if the image of countless tribes driving weak sheep and horses, rolling up tattered tents, through the wind and snow, along the Chilean mountains towering into the clouds, desperately searching for a path to the west. Along the way, frozen corpses littered the ground and vultures cried out strangely. What a magnificent and tragic scene this was. What a great migration this was. How could Shi Hu tolerate the northern tribes coming over? Fan Xian asked worriedly. The emperor laughed. There was boundless confidence and pride in his laughter. Shi Hu has long been crippled by us. How would they dare to eat these foreign snow wolves? Although there are many more people in Shi Hu after a few major battles, the two sides have still formed an alliance. Fan Xian sighed. If the Hu people truly formed an alliance, then the neighboring Qing kingdom would receive the greatest threat. No wonder the emperor was so careful when dealing with the military. Seeing Fan Xian's worry, the emperor calmly said, "What are you thinking about?" "I am thinking that this information is probably still top secret. However, a great battle will probably come. I am willing to charge into the front lines." Fan Xian's words were not fake or pretty. He really did want to go to the grasslands and enjoy riding horses. However, it seemed that no one had explained the internal problems of the court. The emperor smiled mockingly and said, "Don't think that just because you are a martial ace that you can lead troops into battle for military merit. Once a great battle starts, millions of people will kill each other. Unless you are Uncle Lu Yun, you will still have a fate of being cut to pieces." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. The emperor paused slightly and then calmly said, "The Hu barbarians are not to be feared. I have never thought much of them. However, since the northern barbarians have moved, the pressure on northern Qi has immediately lessened. I have no choice but to look toward the north." Fan Xian immediately understood. The emperor's gaze indeed moved faster than his. In this world, the only true enemy of the Qing kingdom was northern Qi, particularly since the northern barbarians had left. Northern Qi had nothing to worry about. Who knew if the little emperor would have other thoughts? In the end, the emperor slowly said, "Xiaoyi will return to the north in a few days because the little emperor in the north has finally convinced the empress dowager to have Shangshanhu rise again. The main camp is charging toward Yanjing." Shock flashed through Fan Xian's eyes and he immediately restrained it. Outside the royal palace, in the black carriage, Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows. He felt a bit uncomfortable. For one, he was too tired. For another, he had heard too much bad news in the palace. Just as the emperor had said, without a few years of rest, Shi Hu would not be able to pose a real threat to the Qing kingdom. However, in northern Qi, Shangshanhu had returned. Shangshanhu. Fan Xian's head hurt when he thought of this name. Although he had not seen the assassination on the long street that rainy night, he had always deeply understood the power of that famous general. Could Yan Xiaoyi go to the north to stop Shangshanhu? Furthermore, Brother Xiaoyi had recently lost a son. He would probably gradually grow apart from the court. The emperor was not afraid that Yin Xiaoyi would go crazy and join the enemy. As for why Fan Xian was so wary of Shang Shanhu's return, the reason was actually very simple. In Shangjing, he had ruthlessly schemed against Shang Shanhu and caused countless of his subordinates to die wretchedly. In the middle of the night, a cry of "Fan Xian, the one who killed me," was probably still echoing in northern Qi's Shangjing. Furthermore, Shang Shanhu's adoptive father, Sir Xiaoen, had been captured and killed by him again and again. In this matter, Fan Xian was Shang Shanhu's greatest enemy. Xinzhong was only a minor character. For the sake of revenge, Shang Shanhu had killed Xinzhong with a spear in that rainy night. If they actually met on the battlefield in the future, how would Shang Shanhu deal with him? Fan Xian thought sorrowfully in the carriage. There were so many enemies in this world. I just couldn't find a way to add quality to the replies in the new book review section. Whoosh. Everyone forgive my stupidity. Tomorrow is Monday. Everyone has to work and go to school again. I wish you peace. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 469. The emperor had once said in the palace that if he wanted to use Yen Xiaoyi, he dared to use little Yen Xiaoyi. At that time, Fan Xian wished he could stretch out a microphone and ask him, "What exactly are you feeling?" What exactly was his mood like? If one had to look at a person's heart, be careful not to look until you bleed from every orifice. Until now, Fan Xian only had a faint feeling for the emperor. Logically speaking, he did not need to worry so much about the survival of the Qing kingdom and the life and death of the emperor. For the future of himself and his family, he had no choice but to do his utmost. This was helpless. The carriage left the South City gate. The four wheels bumped against the hard ridge in succession. Fan Xian, who had been in a daze, immediately woke up. Lifting the curtain, he walked out. As he yawned, he looked toward the road to the south. It was already afternoon. There were not many people entering the city. The city gate guards responsible for the city gates and the soldiers responsible for defense of the Jingdo garrison were carrying out their daily work with boredom. Suddenly, they saw a black carriage arrive at the city gate under the protection of a dozen Overwatch Council officials. Everyone's hearts jumped. Looking at the yawning young official under the carriage, everyone immediately guessed his identity. The commander of the Tianan city gate guards had received the news and quickly ran over. He brought a long bench and offered Fan Xian hot tea. Fan Xian did not stand on ceremony. Holding the teacup, he gulped it down in large gulps. Before long, the figure of a group of carriages appeared at the end of the road. Following the row of wild trees on the horizon, they gradually came closer and closer. In a moment, they had arrived in front of the city gate. Fan Xian went up to welcome them. The group of carriages stopped. Gao Da and 7 other tiger guards stepped out of the carriage, as well as a group of 6 bureau swordsmen. With a swish, they knelt on the ground and bowed to him. Fan Xian waved his hand and had them rise. He couldn't help saying a few warm words of praise, but his feet did not stop. He climbed directly into the carriage in the middle. Lifting the curtain, he saw her holding a blue cloth bag and dozing off. Her long eyelashes rested peacefully on her pale skin. A lock of bangs fell peacefully on her forehead, hiding a girl's tiredness. Fan Xian didn't want to wake her up. He just sat by her side and took the blue cloth bag from her arms. At the same time, he glanced at the person opposite him with confusion. Cece, who was sitting across from him, blinked her eyes and said in a small voice, "We did it for a long time last night. Our spirits aren't very good today." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything more. He signaled for the carriages to enter the city. He only reminded Gao Da and the others in a quiet voice to be careful when they entered the city gate ridge and not wake the person in the carriage. The carriage passed through half the streets of Jingdo and came to a quiet street in the south of the city. It stopped in front of the main gate of Fan Manor. The carriage stopped and Wanner woke up in a daze. She subconsciously hugged the arm next to her and rubbed against it. She felt a warmth that she hadn't felt for a long time return to her side. She snuggled deeper into the warmer embrace. But she woke up immediately. The girl jumped in fright and jumped up. Only then did she realize that beside her was Fan Xian, who had already fallen asleep. She put her heart back into her stomach. Looking at the familiar face that she had not seen in a long time, she couldn't resist smiling innocently and sticking out her tongue. Clap, 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 clap. A string of noisy firecrackers rang out and startled Fan Xian out of his dreams. He grumbled angrily and pulled his arm back to find that he was hugging empty air. Puzzled, he opened his eyes to look and saw his wife curled up in the corner of the chair, looking at him. Earlier, Wanner had stared at Fan Xian in a daze. A moment later, she realized that Cici was also across from him. She also discovered that Fan Xian had been startled awake by the firecrackers. For a moment she felt very awkward and blushed. Fan Xian gazed at his wife and smiled. With one hand holding the blue cloth bundle, he led her out of the carriage. He didn't say anything in detail. On the contrary, he grumbled, "Which manor is getting a new bride? Why is it so lively?" Wanner covered her mouth and smiled. Pointing at the main gate of Fan Manor, she said, "I also think it's strange. It's our family that is setting off firecrackers. I wonder what joyous event it is." At this time, Cici also came down with her small bundle. Looking at the busy scene of people coming and going in front of the main gate of Fan Manor, red lanterns hanging high and firecrackers exploding, she also jumped in fright. With a cry, she said in a loud voice, "Young master, young mistress, are you welcoming us back from Jiangnan?" The group of carriages stopped in front of Fan Manor's gate. Fan Xian looked at this scene with curiosity. He couldn't resist grabbing Zheng Kuo, who had come out of the manor to welcome him, and asked, "Sir Zheng, what is going on?" Zheng Kuo laughed and said, "Young master, you have been made the Duke of Dambua today. This is a joyous occasion. Countless people from various departments and pavilions have come to congratulate you. At this moment they are all waiting in the manor for your return. Of course, we have to properly celebrate such a glorious event." Fan Xian paused. Only now did he remember that he had become a duke. Raising his head to look at the red cloth hanging on the Fan Manor's plaque, he couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Lin Wanner glanced at him in shock and asked, "Husband, you have been made a duke?" Fan Xian nodded. Hearing these words, Lin Wanner's brows were full of joy. Even Cici, who was beside her, could not escape. She was very happy. After all, in this world these things were always important. For an official to be made a duke at Fan Xian's age, no matter where it was placed, it was a particularly glorious matter. Along the way there were officials who came forward to congratulate and bow. Fan Xian hurriedly returned the greeting. He could only have the wife of the Teng family come out and first take Wanner Cici and the serving girls into the inner manor. The faces of the servants of the Fan Manor were full of joy. They continuously knelt and kowtowed toward Fan Xian. Reward, reward. Along the way there were rewards given out. Fan Xian did not feel any pain. However, he felt that there was no need to be so happy. Even Wanner and Cici were so happy. If his sister was home, who knew if she would also be overjoyed. After finally tidying up everything and properly seeing off the guests, the Fan Manor finally gathered in the flower hall in the garden. Lady Lu sat by Fan Jian's side. Her brows were also full of smiles. Cici had just returned to the Fan Manor when she was given the glorious task of arranging the banquet. In the past, this task had always been the responsibility of Lady Lu, who was not an official member of the family. This meant that the Fan Manor had already acknowledged Cici's position. Fan Jian said a few words to his subordinate son and wife and then talked about Cici's matter. In any case, it had already been done in Danzhou. With the old ancestor's approval, he, as the master of the Fan Manor, would not say anything more. After the banquet was prepared, there were no other people in the flower hall. Fan Xizha, who had been cooped up at home, finally ran out. He first greeted his sister-in-law and then sat by Fan Xian's side, shamelessly asking for a favor. Wanner was startled. Wasn't her brother-in-law in northern Qi? Why did he sneak back? Fan Xian opened his mouth to scold, "It's just a lousy title of nobility. Is it worth it for you to be so greedy?" Fan Xizha shrunk his neck and said, "You don't really care? How many dukes are there in this world?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "But you don't need to ask for a reward from me. Do you think you're lacking in silver? I think in another 2 years father and I will have to stretch out our hands to ask you for money." Fan Xizha chuckled and said, "Even silver can't buy Big Brother's reputation. In the future you will be a prince. When will you think of a way to get me a title of nobility?" Fan Xian paused. Only now did he remember that after the Baoyue brothel incident last autumn, Fan Xizha had been issued an arrest warrant by the Ministry of Justice. The title of nobility he had received since he was a child had been removed. Hearing the word prince, Fan Xian still felt a little strange. He and his father met each other's eyes. They both understood the judgment in each other's hearts. Given Fan Xian's identity, being a first-rate duke was the limit. No matter what, he could not become a prince. Unless something happened in the future. The banquet immediately became silent. Fan Xijia also knew that there was something wrong with what he said and didn't dare say anything else. Wan looked at this scene and smiled charmingly. She said to her brother-in-law, "Since you're back, don't be in such a hurry to leave. After dinner, play a few more rounds with father and mother." Once Fan Xijia heard that he was going to play mahjong, and it was his sister-in-law who had suggested it, he immediately perked up. He had not met a match at the mahjong table in Northern Qi for more than a year. Tonight he was going to play against his sister-in-law, the second best in the world. He was very excited. The next few days were peaceful. There were not many stories to tell. The second prince's faction was beaten until everyone was panicking. The eldest princess sat calmly in the palace, thinking about something. Fan Xian only occasionally thought of the crown prince's strange behavior in Baoyue brothel and became very confused. This crown prince was the rightful heir to the throne of Qing Kingdom. Naturally, the method he chose to respond was the best one. However, looking at the way the situation was going, where did his confidence come from? Fan Xian couldn't figure this out. Fan Jian also didn't figure it out. The crown prince dared to watch so coldly from the sidelines unless he had a powerful helper in his hands. However, the eldest princess who had originally supported him, had long been exposed by Fan Xian to her relationship with the second prince. What right did the crown prince have to believe the eldest princess' words again? Since he couldn't figure it out, he stopped thinking about it. He still had to return to Jiangnan next spring. After the new year, there were places like Qin Garden, King Jing's manor, and the great prince's manor that he had to visit. Thus, taking advantage of the few days before the new year, Fan Xian didn't go to the Overwatch Council or enter the palace. He just stayed obediently in the Fan Manor, being filial to his father, whom he hadn't seen in a year, and disciplining his brother, who had been in the north for a long time. The atmosphere of a family reunion was not bad. However, it was missing Ruoruo and the old ancestor of Danzhou. At one time, Fan Xian had once privately said to his father that his grandmother had not seen Xijia for a long time. Should he find a time for Xijia to return to Danzhou? Fan Jian thought about it. It was indeed reasonable, so he let Fan Xian make the arrangements. Just as the situation was developing in a peaceful manner, on the 28th of the 12th month, an uninvited guest came to the Fan Manor. This guest was Northern Qi's envoy to the Qing Kingdom. His identity was a bit sensitive, but he had specially reported to the office of the Grand Herald before coming to the front door of the Fan Manor. Everyone in the Fan Manor felt it was strange, but they could only open the front door to welcome him. This envoy was very respectful to Fan Xian and represented the Northern Qi court in conveying their condolences to Fan Xian. He said that regarding the attack in the valley, the Northern Qi people felt the same and deeply felt injustice for Sir Fan Jr. After putting down a large pile of gifts, the envoy left the manor, leaving only Fan Jian and Fan Xian looking at each other stupidly. That night, someone from the office of the Grand Herald of the Qing Kingdom came. A eunuch from the internal court also came to explain to Fan Xian why the Northern Qi envoy had come to visit. The news of Fan Xian's assassination had already reached Northern Qi. For some reason, the Northern Qi emperor had personally written a private letter and asked someone to send it to the Qing emperor. He expressed his concern about Fan Xian's assassination and expressed hidden criticism of the Qing court for not paying attention to Fan Xian's personal safety. Hearing these words, Fan Xian looked at the eunuch and the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald and sucked in a breath of cold air. He opened his mouth and cursed, "Wrinkling a pond of spring water, none of their *king business." The vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald and the eunuch looked at each other awkwardly. We all understand what the Northern Qi people are thinking. Sir Fan Jr., there is no need to be so angry. What use is such a dirty trick? The eunuch also said with a sinister smile, "If they want to give you gifts, just accept them." After seeing the two of them out of the manor, Fan Xian hurried into the study and asked his father, "What exactly do the Northern Qi people want? Do they have the right to express concern about this matter?" Fan Jian forced a smile and said, "There is something I've always forgotten to tell you. The emperor also seems to have forgotten about this. When you went to Northern Qi as a diplomatic envoy, didn't you promise their emperor in the royal palace in Shangjing that when you had time, you would go to their imperial college to give a lecture?" Fan Xian thought about it seriously. It seemed that there really was such a thing, but he didn't seem to have agreed. Fan Jian sighed and said, "When you went to Jiangnan, the Northern Qi people sent a document to the office of the Grand Herald saying they wanted to hire you as a visiting professor at the imperial college in Shangjing. The emperor only thought the little emperor was bored and didn't think much of it. Who would have thought that the Northern Qi people were waiting here?" Now that you are a visiting professor at the Imperial College in Shangjing and have been assassinated in the Qing Kingdom, it seems reasonable for them to express concern and anger. Fan Xian said angrily and bitterly, "What good does it do for them to play tricks on me at this time?" Fan Jian raised his head and glanced at his son. He shook his head and said, "Although it is a crude method and someone with some brains wouldn't believe this kind of provocation, your shady dealings with the northern Qi people in Jiangnan cannot be hidden forever. After accumulating and destroying them, who knows whether or not the emperor will suspect you in the future. They only need to send some gifts, bring a few words and lose some face. Then they can take root in your throat. This kind of business is very profitable." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and felt great anger. The valley attack, yet the little emperor of northern Qi has unexpectedly caused trouble. It looks like the court will not continue investigating. Fan Jian glanced at him and smiled bitterly. Originally the emperor didn't want to investigate. Now that there is such a useful reason, how can he bear to not use it? Fan Xian also smiled bitterly. A moment later, he said seriously to his father, "Father, on the first day of the year, I want to enter the ancestral hall." Fan Jian was not very surprised. From the moment the emperor had officially granted Fan Xian the title of Duke of Dongbua, he had understood the emperor's thoughts. He only calmly said, "I want to enter the palace and ask clearly about this matter. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 470. Just as the people in Baoyue brothel had once said, Jingdo had been peaceful for a year. The biggest reason was because Fan Xian had been exiled to Jiangnan for an entire year. Following Fan Xian's return to the capital, the peaceful Jingdo could no longer maintain its apparent calm. For one, he just so happened to be at the point of conflict between various powers. For another, his style of doing things was completely different from that of a so-called immortal poet. It was even much more ruthless than the style of most of the nobles in the Qing kingdom. The attack in the valley, the assassination in the night in Jingdo, the silent deaths of certain people, and the humiliating imprisonment of certain officials made the nobles in Jingdo once again deeply feel Fan Xian's power and determination. It made them understand that Sir Fan Jr. had been raised in the spring sunshine of Jiangnan for a year, but it had not made his personality much gentler. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, shocking things happened one after another. The most recent thing was that the Northern Qi court had shamelessly come over and shamelessly expressed their love for Fan Xian. With unusual disgust, they criticized the Qing court for not protecting Sir Fan Jr.'s safety. Everyone in Jingdo found this absurd and angry. To put it another way, this was Qing domestic politics. When was it the place for rotten Northern Qi scholars to speak up? However, the Northern Qi people had spoken up, and they had spoken up particularly loudly. In an instant, Fan Xian was pushed to the heart of the struggle. Although the clever people did not believe that he had any shameful collusion with Northern Qi because Northern Qi's methods were too childish, the nobles and common people of the Qing kingdom still felt uncomfortable in their hearts. The gazes they turned toward the Fan manor were complicated. The storm of this matter had not calmed. In just 2 days, on the first day of the new year, the entire Jingdo became fearful because of another matter related to the Fan manor. There was not a glimmer of light in the sky. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and rubbed his slightly sore eyes. He thought to himself, is there a need to be so sneaky about paying respects to the ancestors? Yesterday was New Year's Eve, and the whole family played mahjong through the night. After Fan Xizha and Lin Wan divided up the family's assets, the mahjong game ended, and the whole family immediately got on the carriage and left the manor. Along the way, there were carriages from the other branches of the Fan clan converging together. Although each branch was calm, such a long line of carriages did indeed appear to be rather large. Fan Xian felt a faint excitement and nervousness in his heart. This was the first time he was paying respects to the ancestors, so he didn't know it should be at the 5th watch. Last year, when Fan Manor paid respects to the ancestors, he and Wanner had stayed in the garden. He vaguely remembered that it should have been in the afternoon. He glanced at the sleeping Xizha beside him and couldn't resist shaking his head with a smile. In his own carriage, presumably no yamen in the Qing kingdom would be blind enough to search for Xizha, this criminal. Thinking that he could finally enter the ancestral hall today, the smile on his face never faded. He did not know how his father had negotiated with the emperor when he entered the palace, but in the end, it was clear that the emperor had helplessly nodded and the empress dowager had maintained her silence. Speaking of which, since the royal family could not give him a title, Did they want him to never have a reliable surname for the rest of his life? Fan Xian smiled coldly. In reality, he could guess the outcome of his father's negotiations with the emperor. The emperor had made him the Duke of Donbua. In his opinion, he had already given enough of an explanation. Furthermore, given the situation at hand, the emperor did indeed need Fan Xian to clarify his identity to prevent his son's fight for the family property from becoming more complicated. The Overwatch Council's reduction of power was far from enough. If Fan Xian wanted to continue walking the path of a powerful official, the first thing he had to do was remove himself from the ranks of the princes. The carriages traveled for an indeterminable amount of time and waited for a while outside the city gates. When the gates opened, they drove out under the soldiers' unconcerned gazes. Following the official road all the way west, they finally entered the country estate that Fan Xian had once visited, the Fan clan's ancestral property. Over 30 carriages lined up and stopped on the dam outside the ancestral hall. The people of the country estate had long come to receive them. It was like this every year. They had all become skilled workers. Temporary bamboo shelters for the women to sit in had long been put up. Lady Lu Wanner Sisi, and the elders and women of the other branches had all been received into the courtyard to rest. The present leader of the Fan clan, Minister of Revenue Fan Jian, stood at the bottom of the steps of the ancestral hall. He wore a tricolored formal robe and looked calmly at everything in front of him. However, a warm and happy feeling welled up in his heart. He had raised a son for the emperor and finally raised his own son. Could this be considered the most successful day of his life? The leading figures of each branch of the Fan clan had already disembarked from the carriages and stood in order of seniority outside the ancestral hall. They stole glances at the leader at the head of the table. Each of them had complicated emotions in their hearts. 30 years ago, the Fan clan was already one of the large clans in the capital. Fan Jian's branch was only a side branch and weak family. If it had not been for that old ancestor who had supported the present emperor and King Jing, how could Fan Jian have become the leader of the clan? After Fan Jian became the leader, he was very strict with the members of the clan. His own official position grew higher and higher. No one in the clan dared to disobey him. Furthermore, there was now another person called Fan Xian in the Fan Manor. Everyone put down the clothes they needed to worship the ancestors. Peace incense was lit. The sacrificial items had already been prepared. The monk who often served in the ancestral hall respectfully spread out a row of felt blankets and slowly pulled open the main doors of the ancestral hall. With a creak, the doors made of black wood were pulled open. A gust of cold wind surged out from inside. It was as if the ancestors of the Fan clan were coldly watching their descendants. The hundreds of men of the Fan clan lowered their heads and lined up. At this time, the door of a carriage behind them opened. Fan Xian, dressed in cloth clothing, calmly stepped out. Following his father's hand signal at the bottom of the stone steps, he slowly moved forward between the two groups of men. The atmosphere in front of the ancestral hall had been solemn. The men of the Fan clan didn't even dare to breathe too loudly for fear of disturbing the spirits of their ancestors. However, when they saw the man who walked down from the carriage, they still couldn't help but widen their eyes in shock and surprise. Their mouths gaped open as they let out countless sighs of surprise. At the back of the line were the teenagers. After seeing Fan Xian, they were even more frightened. These were the pitiful little overlords whose legs had been broken by Fan Xian outside Baiyue brothel and whose buttocks had been smashed by Lady Lu in the Fan Manor. Fan Xian had also come to worship the ancestors. These little overlords of the Fan clan were so frightened that their legs trembled. Fan Xian walked steadily forward and gradually approached the stone steps of the ancestral hall. He saw that at the bottom of the steps, his father seemed to be arguing about something in a low voice with a few elders. Fan Xian had seen those elders before. He knew that they were virtuous and well-respected elders in the Fan clan. One of them seemed to be someone he had to call uncle. The face of the highest-ranking uncle in the Fan clan was full of worry. He quietly said to Fan Jian, "Ida, this is not appropriate." Fan Jian smiled slightly and said, "Second uncle, what is not appropriate?" The uncle's eyes were full of fear. Lowering his voice, he said, This child? He suddenly stopped talking. Did he have to say in front of the clan leader that his son was not his own? But he was still terrified. The elders of the Fan clan in front and behind him were also terrified. They had not thought that this year's worship of the ancestors would create such a large ruckus. It was all because the manor had quietly brought Fan Xian here. Everyone began to talk at once. Although they didn't dare say it openly in front of Minister Fan, they all vaguely expressed their worry. However, they didn't dare speak too loudly for fear of disturbing the ancestors in the ancestral hall. Everyone was dissatisfied. They thought, he is not a descendant of the Fan family, what right does he have to worship the ancestors? What they were more afraid of was that Fan Xian was the son of the dragon. Would the Empress Dowager and the Emperor be unhappy that he had returned to the Fan family? Fan Xian did not give these elders a chance to start a debate. He had already walked in front of his father. First, he bowed respectfully to the elders and then stood by his father's side. Fan Jian smiled slightly and pointed to a spot in the line. Your place is there. Seeing that the clan leader would not listen, no one dared to object. These elders of the Fan clan were actually more afraid of the scent that Fan Xian carried on his body. The ancestors are meritorious, the clan is virtuous. All things come from heaven, man from the ancestors. White smoke curled around the inside and outside of the ancestral hall. Utensils were on display. The men kowtowed one by one. Amidst the rising and falling chanting, the Fan clan's worship of the ancestors proceeded steadily. However, people couldn't resist sneaking a few glances at Fan Xian. Fan Xian had already knelt, bowed and kowtowed in the ancestral hall. Now, he stood to the side and looked at the paper flowers filling the sky and the snow on the distant mountaintop in a daze. He knew that his name could finally be recorded in the Fan clan's genealogy. For a moment, a bright color appeared in the depths of his heart. Fan Xizha kowtowed in the direction of the ancestral hall in the carriage. It was not convenient for him to get off. Fan Xian stood by the carriage and couldn't resist sighing. He thought to himself that he had been reborn. In the cave in northern Qixi Mountain, in front of the dying Shaoan, he had acknowledged his belonging to this world. Now, in front of the Fan clan's ancestral hall, he had once again confirmed his belonging to this world. His life had finally been branded with an indelible mark. He was intimately connected to this world and could no longer be separated. The morning light arrived early. The white fog in the country estate and the fog in the ancestral hall mixed together and could no longer be separated. As Fan Xian stood by the carriage outside the ancestral hall of the Fan clan and sighed, almost at the same time, across half of the Qing kingdom's territory, in one of the largest manors in the world outside Suzhou in Jiangnan, Xia Qifei knelt in front of the ancestral tablets and cried silently outside the ancestral hall that was even taller and more majestic than the Fan clan's ancestral hall. No, it should be said that the present seventh young master of the Ming family, Ming Qingqing, trembled in front of the ancestral tablets and allowed tears to wash his face. The current head of the Ming family, Ming Qingda, used a complicated gaze to look at the crying Ming Qingqing, his seventh brother who had left home when he was young. Ming Lanshi stood below fourth uncle and looked at this seventh uncle, who had never had the opportunity to enter the ancestral hall to worship the ancestors. His face remained calm, but the depths of his heart were filled with a sense of defeat. Fourth uncle had been released by the Suzhou government half a year ago. From then on, he began to be tied together with Xia Qifei and opposed the Ming family at every turn. Without question, that failed assassination had made the fourth Ming master give up on the Ming family leader. The Ming family's situation was difficult. There was too little silver to circulate, so they could only stretch out their hands. Although Zhaoshang Money House had provided great help, if the business on the Eastern Road and on the sea did not improve much and they continued to borrow money, then there would be too many problems. Furthermore, there was now another power within the family. His aunt's son stood by the fourth Ming master's side. Thinking of this, Ming Lanshi hated the imperial envoy far away in Jingdou. The present situation had been single-handedly created by that person, including Xia Qifei entering the ancestral hall to worship the ancestors and return to the ancestral home. It was also part of the agreement made back then. Ming Lanshi didn't know why his father would agree to this request. Xia Qifei wiped away the tears on his face and knelt on the ground. Facing the ancestral tablets, he quietly said in a voice only he could hear, "Father, mother, that old witch is already dead. I have finally returned." Ever since he was a child, he had been chased out of the Ming family home and had escaped death countless times. Even when he later became the commander of the Jiangnan water bandits, he had only thought of one day using blood and fire to get revenge. However, he himself could only become a lonely ghost. He had never dared to hope that he could openly return to the Ming family. Presently, he was not only the commander of the Jiangnan water bandits, but also the unknown supervisor of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Jiangnan Road. He was already the owner of Xia Mingji and was responsible for the sale of palace treasury goods in northern Qi Road. At this moment, he had also obtained the identity of the 7th young master of the Ming family. In the future, the Ming family's enormous fortune would have his share. It might even all be his. Of course, Xia Qifei knew that even if the Ming family became his in the future, what was his would also be Sir Fan Jr.'s. Everything he had now was given to him by Sir Fan Jr. with both hands. Xia Qifei was a person who knew how to repay kindness. He was also someone who knew his limits and did not have too much ambition. As long as he could get his revenge and return to the Ming family, everything was fine. The fourth Ming master, who had long lost the ruthlessness of the past, went forward and helped him up. Comfortingly he said, "Seventh brother, as long as you're back it's fine." "Thank you, fourth brother." Xia Qifei stood and stared blankly at the head of the Ming family. Shortly after he smiled and said, "Big brother, then I'll go out first." Ming Qingda smiled slightly and walked a few steps closer. Moving close to his ear, he said in a quiet voice that only the two of them could hear, "Seventh brother, there is still a lot of time. I won't keep you for a meal today." This was something he had forcefully forced Ming Qingda to agree to before he left Jiangnan. Since he had already done it, he did not have much of a good attitude toward the seventh Ming master. Xia Qifei laughed coldly. He knew the hidden meaning in Ming Qingda's words. Jiangnan and the Ming family were now split into two. As for who would be the leader, it would still depend on the outcome of the struggle in the palace in Jingdo. During this year, Ming Qingda had endured silently and used all his methods to delay Fan Xian's ruthless methods in order to buy time and wait for Jingdo's counterattack. He believed that he wouldn't have to endure for much longer. However, Xia Qifei's thoughts were the exact opposite of Ming Qingda's. He was also waiting. He was waiting for the day that Sir Fan Jr. would completely win. He had never believed that Sir Fan Jr. would fail. Walking out of the main door of the Ming Ancestral Hall, Xia Qifei glanced at the various expressions of the clan disciples in the garden. A self-mocking smile appeared on his face. Thinking about it, not many of these clan disciples truly saw him as the seventh master. The fourth Ming master had been following by his side the entire time. In a quiet voice he said, "Although we already have 3 people on our side, he is, after all, the head of the family. Some things cannot be hidden from him. We don't need to worry about business." Traces of tears remained at the corners of Xia Qifei's eyes. Calmly he said, "Put as many guards in the garden as you can. I will send someone to keep an eye on it. If after the situation is settled and he still wants to struggle at death's door, then don't blame us for being heavy-handed." The fourth master was startled and furrowed his brows. "Don't mess around. All of Jiangnan is watching Ming Garden. Even Sir Fan Jr. would not dare to do such a thing." Xia Qifei was startled. He didn't say anything more and walked out of Ming Garden. Outside the garden, beside the carriage, Su Wumei, who had lost an arm, was waiting for him. She looked at the traces left on Xia Qifei's face and knew that he must have suffered a great emotional upheaval. She forcefully suppressed her excitement and said, "Congratulations, First Master." Xia Qifei smiled. "Congratulations, cousin." Su Wumei smiled warmly. "Congratulations, Seventh Master." On the first day of the new year, in the manor of Jingdo, the second prince was drinking tea and playing Go with Yi Ling. Suddenly, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps coming from outside the study. He couldn't help furrowing his brows slightly. Although his power in Jingdo had been completely uprooted by Fan Xian, it was just as he had said in Baoyue brothel. He was not worried at all because these were only minor problems. As long as Fan Xian could not touch him, the root of the royal family in the future, it would be Fan Xian's turn to be worried. The housekeeper knocked and entered. Disregarding Wang Fei sitting in her seat, he hurriedly moved closer to the second prince's ear and told him the shocking news he had just heard. The second prince's expression immediately changed. The black, matte chess piece between his 2 fingers fell into the teacup and made a pft. After the housekeeper left, Yi Ling asked with a smile, "What happened now?" In the eyes of this young imperial concubine who was not yet 20, the more wretchedly her husband was beaten by her teacher, the better. It would be best if he was beaten until his heart gave out and he no longer cared about the matter of the dragon chair. Fan Xian was beating the tiger in Jingdo while Yi Ling was secretly laughing in the manor. Seeing the shock on her husband's face, she thought that her teacher was doing something again, so she was not worried. On the contrary, she had the urge to watch a good show. It took a long time for the second prince to ease the shock in his heart. Looking at his wife in astonishment, he said, "Fan Xian, he went to worship the ancestors today." Chapter 471. Yesterday, I typed the one-armed sister's surname incorrectly. My original surname was Guan, but I had no choice but to follow Su. Here I deeply apologize. P.S. This book is very easy to buy. Next week I'll go to the specialty store and say the cheapest one. Yi Ling'er made a sound and covered her mouth. She was so shocked that she couldn't speak. Although she had spent every day in Fan Xian's manor and played mahjong on the Tsang Mountains after Fan Xian had come to the capital, she had some understanding of her young master's will. She had never imagined that at this juncture, Fan Xian would bravely choose to return to the family. The second prince glanced at her and smiled bitterly. I'm wondering if Fan Xian has gone crazy. Why do you say that? A glimmer of doubt flashed through Yi Ling'er's jade-like eyes. Since Fan Xian dared to worship his ancestors, it must have been something that the Empress Dowager and the Emperor had tacitly agreed to. Why did her husband still think Fan Xian had gone crazy? The second prince shook his head. For the present Fan Xian there are only 4 paths he can take. By choosing to return to his ancestral home, he has directly blocked off 2 of them. Yi Ling'er did not continue to ask. She listened quietly. The second prince thought for a moment and then quietly said, right now he has too much power in his hands. He has offended too many people. The power of a lone official has already formed. For him, in the future in Qin Kingdom he will either fight with us for the throne, or he will support the third prince to rise to power while he hides behind the scenes and becomes a regent. Only these 2 paths can ensure the peace of his family and not be uprooted. Since he has returned to the Fan family, naturally the possibility of him inheriting the throne has been severed. It is impossible to use the identity of a member of the royal family to act as regent. Yi Ling'er furrowed her brows. Even if he does not acknowledge his ancestral home, given his past, not to mention whether or not the emperor will allow him to inherit the throne, the entire royal family and the scholars of the court will not agree. This first option in itself is impossible. What is impossible? The second prince asked. As long as he does not return to the Fan family, there is a chance that the palace will accept him again. Adding to the power in his hands, who dares to say that it is impossible for him to fight for the world? What about the second item? A prince-regent might be able to make the nobles in the palace and the royal family military outside the palace remain silent, as long as his surname is Li. But for a powerful official with the surname Fan to threaten the emperor and order the feudal vassals, that is impossible. The second prince calmly said, that is why Fan Xian's return today directly cut off the 2 paths he mentioned earlier. I don't understand what exactly he is thinking. What are the other 2 paths? Yi Ling'er looked at the strange expression on the prince's face and suddenly felt a chill in her heart. The second prince paused for a moment and then said, in the future after father passes away, regardless of who ascends to the throne, I'm afraid they will carry out a great purge of Fan Xian and the Fan clan. If they don't purge, no one has the confidence to completely control the situation. These were the words the second prince had said to Fan Xian in Baoyue brothel. He had always thought that Fan Xian would gradually integrate into the royal family and fight for a position on the surface. Regardless of whether Fan Xian fought for the dragon chair himself or helped the third prince, they were both possible paths. Given Fan Xian's present strength as well as the old people he influenced in front of and behind of him, no newly ascended emperor would be able to safely watch him live. Thus, many years from now Fan Xian will only have 2 paths he can take. The second prince furrowed his brows tightly and could not understand it no matter how he thought about it. Otherwise he will wait helplessly and have his entire clan executed, just like the Yi family in the past. He paused and then said tiredly, otherwise he will use the power in his hands to rebel and leave the country. He began to laugh self-mockingly. Of course the power in his hands is all paper. He won't be able to raise much of a storm. Father is a cautious person. If Fan Xian doesn't have an army in his hands, he will never be able to truly become a marquis. Yi Ling'er was startled and carefully savored these words he said. She realized that if the situation really continued to develop like this, her teacher would indeed not have a good end. Her little face swelled slightly and she said, you've forgotten a possibility. If the third prince really does inherit the throne in the future, given his teacher-student relationship with Fan Xian, he may not necessarily let things happen to an irreversible state. The second prince smiled. I've also said this to Fan Xian. Third brother is still young but I've watched him grow up. This kid is not easy to deal with. Furthermore, at what position you have to consider the level of affairs. Sometimes it's not something you or I can stop doing just because we don't want to. He calmly said, furthermore don't forget the crown prince is the true successor. Many people seem to have forgotten this matter because of his calmness, but I believe that Fan Xian will not forget. Most importantly, the second prince slowly lowered his head. Regardless of who inherits the throne before our father leaves this world, will he watch as Fan Xian continues to gather the power of a large group of old monsters and bring endless trouble to his successor? This country is our father's country. He will not let this country become too chaotic, even if he dies. Regardless of whether the second prince was a son or an official, it was already a great taboo to discuss the emperor's life and death. Yiling bit her lip and didn't reply. Instead, she changed the subject and asked, "But this is not the life Fan Xian wants to live. This is what the elders in court have arranged for him. If you were Fan Xian, what would you do?" The second prince was startled. A moment later he self-deprecatingly said, "I don't know what I would do. It would probably be similar to his current situation. However, in the battle for the world, if you don't advance, you die. Since he has personally given up on the first two paths, then he should retreat more thoroughly. If I were in his position at this time, I would enter the palace and ask for my resignation. Regardless of whether it is the Overwatch Council or the palace treasury, he will have to let one of them go. Then, from a purely rational point of view, he should appear more gentle and then secretly lean toward my side." Yiling looked at him. The second prince said seriously, "This is the wisest choice. Presumably, he knows in his heart that I dare to accept him. After all, my aunt is his mother-in-law. With Chen Er's relationship, it is not necessarily impossible to let go of past enmity." Yiling shook her head and sighed. She knew that her family and the distant army in Dingzhou had long become a tool in the battle for the inheritance because of this marriage. If Fan Xian also joined in, naturally, but she didn't want to pay attention to these things. Suddenly she felt a headache and unhappily furrowed her brows. The second prince stood up and looked at the faint light outside the window. Lost in thought, he said, "If Fan Xian doesn't change, he will only walk into a dead end in the future. If he has the courage to change, perhaps he will suffer a great loss now, but in the future he and the Fan family can obtain even greater benefits and a more stable peace. This all depends on what he thinks." In the end, he helplessly lowered his head. However, these 2 years have long proven that Fan Xian is a madman who does not act according to common sense. So, I do not have such extravagant hopes. In the eyes of most people in the Qing kingdom, under Fan Xian's gentle and amiable appearance, there was indeed a glimmer of a crazed murderous aura gradually seeping out. It was not talking about the night battles in Jingdou, but the shocking matter of Jingdou's return to the ancestral home. At the cold of the fifth watch, the Fan family's worship to their ancestors began. At noon, this news had already spread to all the large manors. For a moment, countless people were guessing at the subsequent development of the situation and the rise and fall of Fan Xian's desire for power in the court. Just like the second prince, no one could understand why Fan Xian would do this. Although in the past he only had the identity of the emperor's illegitimate son and had no hope of entering the palace, the identity of an illegitimate son was still an identity. As long as it was not sealed, anything was possible. Furthermore, this identity would certainly be of great use in the future. A long time ago, Qin Pingping had thought that once the Empress Dowager was gone, it was not impossible for Fan Xian to re-enter the ranks of the princes. Fan Xian's actions today had finally branded his name with the brand of the Fan family, cutting off the possibility of his surname being Li. In the eyes of most people, this seemed somewhat foolish or impulsive. Even in the depths of the palace, this news shocked the hearts of many nobles. Lady Shu was transcribing the rare book of Tianyi Pavilion that Fan Xian had sent over with graceful handwriting. Listening to the palace maid's report, she shook her head somewhat sullenly. Lady Ning was in her small courtyard practicing her swordsmanship around a tree. After hearing the news, her face lit up and she praised Fan Xian for having a backbone. In Shufang Palace, Yi Guipin was watching the third prince practice his calligraphy. Hearing Xinger's quiet words, she smiled slightly and said nothing. She only looked at her son with a complicated expression. After a while, she pulled her son behind the curtain and quietly told him the biggest news of the day in Jingdou. She spoke very seriously and solemnly. The third prince was startled. At such a young age he immediately understood many things. His teacher had returned to the family to a large extent for his sake. Finally, Yi Guipin said seriously, "Ping, you must firmly remember everything that Master Fan has done for you. If you dare to do those things in the future, I will not forgive you." The third prince lowered his head and said nothing. In Guangxin Palace, eldest Princess Li Yunrui, who had always lived in seclusion and rarely left the palace, was the first to hear the news. This beautiful woman paused for a moment and then smiled. As the saying goes, one smile can charm 100 people. Just like this, It actually suppressed the light of the white curtains inside and outside the palace and the light of the jade trees. The palace maid asked cautiously, "Princess, why are you so happy?" The eldest princess slowly withdrew her smile and said very softly, "I suddenly feel that my son-in-law is a very good man. He knows when to stop and when to stop. It is a pity that I have only met him once. Tomorrow, arrange for him and Wan to enter the palace. I want to see how young Fan Xian has grown so quickly in the 2 years I have not seen him." The palace maid was startled. Sir Fan Jr.'s actions were clearly too impulsive and did not consider the pros and cons enough. Was the eldest princess happy because of this? Looking at the eldest princess's expression, it was clear that she greatly admired Sir Fan Jr.'s actions. In Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager was picking at her rosary beads and muttering something. Old eunuch Hong was bent over to serve at her side. After a long time the Empress Dowager sighed and said, "That child knows the big picture. It has not been easy." Old eunuch Hong said with a slight hiss, "Sir Fan Jr. is not bad." In the quiet and secluded little building at the back of the royal palace, the Qing Emperor, dressed in a yellow robe, held his hands behind his back. He looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting in a daze. A moment later he quietly said, "Our son is indeed more like you. He is very proud. It is not that I don't want him to come back, it is just that he doesn't want to come back. The surname Fan is good. Back then you and Ida used to call each other brother and sister. Just take it as following your mother's surname." A cold winter breeze blew in through the building and made the painting flutter slightly. The beautiful face of the yellow-clothed woman in the painting twisted slightly. It was as if a mocking smile rose to the corners of her lips. It was as if she was mocking the emperor's words. On the afternoon of the first day of the new year, Fan Xian sat in the carriage heading toward King Jing's manor. This was an old custom between the Fan Manor and King Jing's manor for many years. After the new year, there had to be a day chosen for the people of the two manors to gather together. Fan Xian had been away from Danzhou for 3 years and had long gotten used to the strange, intimate relationship between his family and King Jing's manor. Although Hongqing had been miserably grounded for a year because of Fan Xian's good work, Fan Xian knew that this was actually King Jing's ruthless decision to prevent his manor from being dragged into the fight for the throne. The relationship between the two manors had not been affected by the battles between their sons and nephews. The carriage jolted slightly. Wan looked at Fan Xian in a daze and didn't speak for a moment. Fan Xian smiled. "If you have anything you want to ask, ask away." "I'm thinking that everyone in Jingdo must be talking about you today," Lin Wan said with a smile. "They're all calling you an idiot." Fan Xian smiled even more happily. Suddenly he fell silent again. A moment later he looked into his wife's eyes and said seriously, "I can hide it from everyone under heaven, but I won't hide it from you." Lin Wan smiled slightly and looked into her husband's eyes. Fan Xian calmly said, "In reality the reason is very simple. There are only 2 reasons. First, I have always thought of myself as Fan Xian. I was raised by my grandmother from a young age. I will not accept any other surname. I have always been willing to return to my ancestral home and worship my ancestors, so I will do it." Lin Wan gently leaned against his arm and felt that his breath was very warm and pure. Second, regardless of whether it was openly supporting the third prince in Jiangnan, killing in all directions in Jingdo, or returning to my ancestral home today, I am showing my determination. Fan Xian lowered his head and glanced at Wan'er's round face. Warmly he said, "Donbua shows one's determination. If one wants to go far, one must show one's determination." "What determination? Who are you showing it to?" Fan Xian was silent. He thought of the conversation he had with the emperor in the royal palace. Duke of Donbua, Duke of Donbua? "I don't want to be the emperor," he calmly said. "Of course, it is for the emperor to see." Lin Wan glanced at him worriedly. Although she didn't say anything, Fan Xian knew that she had long seen the future. It was possible that he and the Fan Manor would face a disaster of destruction. Go against the current. If you don't advance, you will fall back. If the boat capsizes, you will die. I understand this principle. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly. "It seems that all the circumstances force me to fight, but the emperor has warned me, so I can only not fight." He smiled and said, "Going with the current is, in the end, more comfortable. There are not many people I am afraid of in this world. However, I am still a bit afraid of your uncle, my cheap father." Lin Wan smiled, but there was still some worry in her smile. "But what about the future?" "The future?" Fan Xian said. "The emperor can live for at least another 20 years. I have used an unknown future danger to exchange for 20 years of peace, or perhaps 20 years of the emperor's trust. This trade is very worth it. Furthermore, I cannot be ambiguous. I must resolutely and decisively demonstrate my attitude and determination. Even if I stand behind the third prince, it is not enough to convince many people. Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows and said tiredly, men and women can be ambiguous. If you do this between ruler and official, it is easy for people to die. I believe the emperor will like my decision. There was still something he did not say to his wife. The so-called ambiguity was certainly two-sided. The so-called decision also worked on both sides. Today he had recognized his ancestors and returned to his ancestral home to express his absolute sincerity to the emperor. He had also seen clearly that the emperor did not want him to take over the world. This reality made Fan Xian relax slightly. After relaxing, there was a sliver of deep worry. The worry was not in the present. Instead, it was in the past. Just as Qin Pingping had confirmed that night, Fan Xian finally confirmed that the emperor had an illness and a heart disease. The carriage stopped in front of King Jing's manor. There were already all kinds of servants waiting outside, welcoming the honored guests from Fan Manor into the manor. Fan Xian led Wan and followed behind his father and Lady Lu in. Looking around, the scenery in the manor was the same as before. However, the white gauze on the other side of the lake was not up. Thinking about it, it was winter. How could there be gauze to block out the light? However, Fan Xian tilted his head to look at the gentle Wan beside him. He still thought of the time when he first fell in love. A slightly old, angry, joyful and complicated voice rang out, pulling Fan Xian out of this rare and brief moment of happiness. You little dog, you still know to come see me. Chapter 472. Only a few pieces of snow remained on the pavilion on the other side of the lake. They were warmly and thinly divided into countless white pieces. It was as if many patches had been added to the dark pavilion. The snow in Jingdo stopped on the 29th of the 12th lunar month. Within 3 days, the servants in King Jing's manor had long swept all the snow from the grass on this side of the lake. However, the weather was cold, so there were no fresh and tender blades of grass on the grass. There were only white grass that had stiffened after death. Yet no one took care of it. It appeared rather desolate. Fan Xian followed quietly behind King Jing. They walked into the depths of the garden, but his gaze lingered on King Jing's slightly hunched back. After entering the manor, Minister Fan came out and blocked King Jing's offensive of dirty words. It was lively for a while, but before he even saw Ro Jia and Hong Qing, King Jing suddenly suggested that Fan Xian follow him for a walk. Although Fan Xian wasn't sure what the king's intention was with this suggestion, seeing his father secretly nod his head, he let him go. Along the way there wasn't much scenery in the garden. Even the vegetable fields that King Jing served day and night were just a few pools of mud. King Jing walked in front and didn't speak, so Fan Xian could only follow in silence. As he examined the king's back, his thoughts had long floated elsewhere. This king was not normal. The history books had seen this kind of self-restrained and even self-defiling absurd kings. However, it was rare to see a noble like King Jing who did it so straightforwardly and truly had no desire for power. Particularly with his old appearance, no one knew what kind of mental blow he had experienced in the past. The two of them stopped by the vegetable fields. King Jing said in a raspy voice, "The first time I saw you, it was in this vegetable garden." Fan Xian thought of that poetry gathering and how he was always a guest in the sorrowful autumn. He thought of how his mind had been filled with lewdness at the time of seeing a smiling white-clothed woman in the vegetable field and then seeing a farmer. He couldn't resist laughing and replied, "You always like to tease the younger generation." "I'm not the only one who grows vegetables in the capital," King Jing said. Fan Xian was startled, thinking that this was not nonsense. Although Jingdo was wealthy, there were still many poor commoners. It was common for these commoners to grow vegetables under the walls of their courtyards to supplement their daily diet. But since King Jing had said so, he naturally had his reasons, so Fan Xian listened quietly. That old guy from the Qin family also likes to grow vegetables, but he only grows cabbages and carrots. King Jing said with a hint of mockery, "Soldiers only know how to fill their stomachs. They don't know that growing vegetables is also an art." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He carefully thought over the prince's words and didn't know how to respond for a moment. King Jing walked into the muddy vegetable field and put his hands on his waist. He looked at the desolate scenery around him. After a moment of silence he said, "Have you found out who did the attack in the valley?" Fan Xian closed his mouth tightly. Of course, he knew that the attack in the valley had been single-handedly arranged by the old killing god of the military, the old Qin master. The problem was, this was presently Qin Kingdom's biggest secret. Other than Qin Pingping and himself, presumably not many people knew. King Jing had first talked about the old Qin master growing vegetables, and now he was talking about the attack in the valley. Was he hinting at something? But King Jing often did not ask about political affairs and did not have any deep connections with the civil and military officials of the court. What right did he have to say that the attack in the valley was done by the old Qin family? However, King Jing did not say anything, so Fan Xian did not know if his guess was correct. Furthermore, he could not tell the other party about the Qin family because it involved the deepest of secrets. He could only smile bitterly and say, "The court has been investigating this entire time, and the council is also investigating. We only know that it has something to do with the military. However, the witness is already dead. There are no clues at all." King Jing turned his head to glance at him as if surprised by his indifference. He thought that the kid did not understand his meaning. He huffed angrily and said, "Idiot." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and thought to himself, in this kind of matter, couldn't he pretend to be stupid? The city guarding crossbow is the Yi family's. King Jing stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "But don't forget about the Qin family." The prince's words were too direct. Fan Xian couldn't pretend anymore even if he wanted to. Other than the suspicion in his heart, he was also particularly moved. This old man was too good to him. He furrowed his brows and said, "I have no enmity with the Qin family." The prince huffed and didn't continue to say anything. Lifting his feet, he walked out of the mud vegetable patch and headed deeper into the garden. Fan Xian looked at his back and vaguely guessed something. The reason the prince dared to guess that the Qin family would act was certainly because of what happened back then. However, the connection between the Qin family and the Taiping courtyard murder case was a secret that even his father did not know. Even Qin Pingping had only found out after a dozen years of investigation. How did the prince know? Thinking of this, hot blood surged in Fan Xian's heart. He didn't care anymore. He caught up and grabbed King Jing's sleeve. King Jing started and slowly turned his head. Fan Xian looked at him and said sincerely, "What exactly happened back then? Why did no one under heaven know that the Qin family was involved? Why was this matter not brought to light when Jingdo bled that night?" "You ask too many questions," King Jing sighed and said. King Jing sighed and said, "Although I'm just an idle king who doesn't do proper work, you have to remember that I'm still a member of the royal family. As for why I know what the two old fellows behind you don't know, the reason is very simple. It's because I was still young back then and I was still with my mother." The corners of the prince's brows twitched. He revealed a mischievous smile. "I was young and always liked to hide and seek everywhere. So, sometimes it was easy to overhear things. As for what I overheard, no one else knows in all these years." Fan Xian forced a smile and stopped. The prince's willingness to point out the Qin family was already a sign of unusual love for him. However, if that matter involved the Empress Dowager, who was the prince's own mother, how could he continue? Yunrui was young at the time. This matter had nothing to do with her. King Jing was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "I still want to make this clear to you. You've followed Fan Jian and the Overwatch Council since you were young and learned a lot. However, there are many things that have also become laughable." At this moment, the old and the young stood on the cold ridge of the field. Not far away was the wall of King Jing's manor. Outside the wall was the unchanging and bleak sky of Jingdo. Fan Xian listened to the prince's words beside him and felt incomparably warm in his heart. What matter? Regardless of whether it is Qin Pingping, that old dog, or your father, they are both masters of scheming. Thus, they always like to make things very complicated. Most importantly, they don't trust anyone, and the one they trust the least is each other. King Jing smiled coldly. This is the stupidest thing. Qin Pingping even suspected Yunrui in the past. He didn't think about how old Yunrui was at that time. Fan Xian forced a smile. The mutual suspicion and wariness between his father and Qin Pingping had existed ever since his mother's death and had grown deeper and deeper. It had only improved after he had entered the capital. "I've swallowed the matter of the old Qin family for so long. Today I'm telling you not for you to take revenge," King Jing said calmly. King Jing calmly said, "I just feel that you have offended the military enough. Our Qin kingdom has always been founded on the military. If you don't know who your true enemy in the military is, I am worried that you will die casually." King Jing said the words casually very seriously. He didn't want anyone else to die casually like this anymore. Fan Xian bowed to the ground and then straightened his body. He asked the question he cared about the most. "Sir, why are you so good to me?" Hearing these words, King Jing suddenly froze. After a long time he suddenly laughed. His laughter grew louder and louder, sharper and more mournful. He laughed until his stomach hurt. He squatted on the ridge of the field and held his abdomen, unable to raise his head for a moment. Fan Xian's mind was in a mess. He stood woodenly to the side and looked at the prince beside him. He looked at the white hair on his head that did not match his actual age fluttering in the cold wind. He looked at the tears squeezed out of the corners of his eyes because of his smile. After a long time, King Jing straightened his body and furrowed his brows in thought. He then said, "I also don't know." He then walked down the ridge of the field. Fan Xian continued to follow silently behind him. "The emperor and I were both raised by my mother," King Jing said calmly. His face had long recovered its usual weathered calmness. At that time, King Cheng's manor was not very eye-catching. It didn't have much status in Jingdo, so my brother and I could still play around. Your father followed us every day. Additionally, there was Qin Pingping, the study companion that the palace had invited. The four of us mingled together every day. I was the youngest, so I was the most bullied. Later, my brother and Qin Pingping went to my mother's old home in Danzhou to play. After they came back, they happily said that they had met an interesting girl there. King Jing smiled. Not long after, that girl arrived in Jingdo and found King Cheng's manor. Fan Xian also smiled. That was my mother. Yes. King Jing leisurely thought about the past. I remember when I was young, I pestered your mother every day to play. Yes, at the time I called her sister Yezi. Your mother loved me very much, so my brother could not let Qin Pingping bully me anymore. This was very good. The old and the young talked as they walked. In a moment they had arrived outside a study. Although Fan Xian wanted to listen more to King Jing talk about the past, he still put his attention on the study because it was clear that few people came to this study. King Jing liked to grow vegetables and did not like to read. King Jing pushed open the door and entered. In a raspy voice he said, "Sit." Fan Xian did not brush away the dust on the seat and sat down calmly. King Jing rummaged through the bookcase for a while and finally found a thick book. He handed it to Fan Xian and said, "Read." Fan Xian accepted it with both hands. He glanced at the cover and saw that it was a book on agronomy. He couldn't help glancing at King Jing gloomily. King Jing was silent for a moment and then said, "Concerning your mother, I don't have much to say. You asked me why I was so good to you. Actually, that's not right. I wasn't good enough to you. At least, I was kept in the dark by them for almost 20 years. King Jing slowly walked out of the study and faced Fan Xian with his slightly slumped back. His voice was slightly dispirited. "I always thought she had no descendants." Fan Xian sat on the dusty chair and casually flipped through the thick book on agronomy. In his heart he was thinking about what King Jing had said earlier. In reality he could faintly capture King Jing's thoughts. It was a touch of youth and bitterness that could not be verbalized, but a thought that he remembered for a lifetime. When a young man was just beginning to grow and there was a gentle, beautiful, all-powerful and all-accepting sister by his side, it was hard to avoid a story like this happening. When he had been reborn into this world he was already a mature soul. In his previous life, how could he not have had such an experience? Which man had not had such an experience? However, for normal people after they grew up, there would always be truly sweet fruits that would fill in their spiritual world. King Jing's normal experience of growing up was clearly interrupted by the great history of the Qin kingdom. The Yi family was destroyed overnight, but King Jing could not be angry and had nowhere to be angry. Thus, his hair turned gray early and his figure was slightly slender. He only respected the fields and not the palace. Fan Xian's fingers flipped through the slightly yellow pages of the book. Suddenly his fingers froze. He saw a few thin pieces of paper stuck in the thick book. His heart jumped. He quickly flipped through the book and found a few more thin pieces of paper. The handwriting on the paper was strange and yet familiar. The writer's brush was clearly not good enough. The strokes were straight and stiff like a matchstick building block. The contents of the paper were not out of Fan Xian's expectations. It recorded some suggestions from someone to someone else, such as the Overwatch Council and the matter of merchants. There were also a few notes about what they wanted to eat that day and where they planned to play the next day. Fan Xian smiled and said to himself as he looked at the pieces of paper, "The other things you wrote have probably all been burned by the people of this world. Who would have thought that the little boy from back then would still have a few left behind?" He tilted his head and said, "However, your handwriting really isn't as good as mine. Furthermore, your strength is focused on the big parts and not the small parts. If you're not used to using a brush, then use a goose feather." Oh, right, I opened a small workshop in the palace treasury that specializes in making pencils. In these things, I'm much smarter than you. After a moment of silence, Fan Xian thought about it and put the pieces of paper into his clothes. Presumably, King Jing also needed this kind of relief. He stood up with a peaceful smile on his face and walked out of the study. King Jing was not outside the study. Fan Xian had come to this manor many times and did not need a serving girl to lead the way. With his hands behind his back, he swayed and swayed until he arrived outside a row of large rooms. This row of rooms formed an independent little courtyard. On the courtyard door hung a large copper lock. Fan Xian looked at this lock and couldn't resist smiling. Walking up the steps, he knocked heavily on the door and yelled, "If you don't open the door, I'm leaving. Don't go. Don't go." A series of urgent shouts came from the courtyard. Someone quickly ran over. The large wooden door made a thud. That person must have hit the door. From this, one could imagine the person's urgency. The door opened a small crack. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked in. He couldn't help but jump in fright. He found that there was also an eye looking out from the other side. There were clearly a few patches of eye wax at the corners of the person's eyes. His hair was messy and he looked extremely haggard. "Damn it." Fan Xian spat. "You're the ghost." Locked in the room, Crown Prince Jing Li Hongqing let loose a torrent of abuse. "Hurry up and fish me out." Fan Xian saw that he was truly pitiful and couldn't help but sigh. However, before he could finish sighing, he laughed again and scolded, "His Highness locked you up. How am I supposed to fish you out? Go plead for mercy for the old man." Li Hongqing was about to go crazy from being locked up. It wasn't easy to see someone who wasn't afraid of his father. How could he let it go? He scolded, "You kid, do you have any conscience? You tricked me, you slandered me, you used filthy words to spray me, I accepted it all, but I've been locked up for so long. Don't you have any sympathy? Remember when you first came to Jingdo, did I treat you badly? I took you to the brothel, I let you pick up girls?" Fan Xian plugged his ears and listened to Li Hongqing's continuous scolding. He knew that this guy was truly too wretched. He smiled bitterly and said, "His Highness locked you up for your own good. Otherwise, if you went out and messed around with those brothers again, in the end, it wouldn't necessarily end well for you. If I die, then I die." Li Hongqing laughed coldly. "It's better than being suffocated to death." Fan Xian took a few steps back and looked at the layout of the courtyard. He couldn't help but say, dumbfounded, "Heavens, it can't be, you've been locked up in this courtyard for a year, right?" Li Hongqing was startled and scolded, "Then I would have gone crazy a long time ago. Usually, I'm just not allowed out of the manor. Although it's all prison, the manor's prison is always a bit bigger." Fan Xian rubbed his nose and nodded his head in admiration. With the manor as a prison, the heart cannot be free. The Crown Prince's words are indeed philosophical. Li Hongqing sighed sorrowfully. "Don't provoke me any more. Originally, it was good for me to stay in the manor and listen to the drama. In the end, as soon as you returned to the capital, you were assassinated. Then you went to kill people. My old man didn't say anything and immediately locked me back in the little courtyard. Tell me, who did I offend?" Fan Xian looked at Li Hongqing's pitiful appearance through the crack in the door. He couldn't help but feel sympathy and remorse in his heart. He knew why King Jing's manor was like this. It was because King Jing didn't want his son to be involved in those matters. As soon as he returned to the capital, he made a big move against the second prince's faction. If Li Hongqing was still tied to the second prince, who knew how he would deal with him? All right. Fan Xian looked around and saw that there was no one around. In a small voice he said, "I'll get you out and take you to have fun. But you have to promise me that you won't go see those people." Li Hongqing was overjoyed and nodded repeatedly. He only said with suspicion, "Don't break this lock. If I want to escape, I don't know how to fight my way out." Fan Xian took out a key from his belt and mockingly said, "Don't forget, I came from the Overwatch Council." The large copper lock opened with a click. King Jing's crown prince, Li Hongqing, who had been locked in the little courtyard without seeing the light of day, finally saw the light of day. He took large steps out and looked at the open surroundings. He took a deep breath and patted Fan Xian's shoulder heavily. "At least you still remember old times." In reality, with such a big commotion, how could the servants in the manor not know? However, since the person in charge was Sir Fan Jr. and the person they were saving was their own crown prince, no one dared to stop him. Right at this moment, a clear and bright voice that was slightly anxious and fearful suddenly resounded. "Brother, why did you run out on your own? Not far to the left of the stone steps stood a young noble lady wearing an apricot red robe. Her little face was red with anxiety. "Be careful, father will beat you to death." Fan Xian turned his head in surprise and looked at the young lady. He saw that she still had that weak and meek appearance. However, there was more elegance and grace between her brows than in the past. He couldn't help but feel shocked. It had only been a year since he had seen her. How had the little girl become such a pure and lovely young lady? The young lady also saw Fan Xian's face clearly and was shocked. She covered her mouth. After the pleasant surprise in her eyes, she suddenly seemed to think of something. Immediately, a thread of mist formed in her eyes and she looked like she was about to cry. Fan Xian's heart was filled with fear. If one had to say who he was most afraid of in Jingdo, other than the emperor in the palace, it would be this young lady in front of him who had deep feelings for him. He remembered that when she was young she clung to his side every day. Fortunately, the dust had long settled. He was her cousin. His heart relaxed a great deal. However, suddenly seeing the young lady's sad appearance, his heart also felt a bit uncomfortable. The young lady finally calmed her emotions. She walked in front of Fan Xian and bowed slightly. Using a mosquito-like voice, she said, "Greetings, Brother Xian." Chapter 473. Fan Xian looked at the girl and wanted to run. Tugging on Hongqing's sleeve, he prepared to play with the two of them over the wall. Unexpectedly, a servant came out of nowhere and bowed to the two of them with a pained expression. "Crown Prince, the king knows you've come out and wants you to see him." Hearing these words, Crown Prince Li Hongqing sucked in a cold breath. He was extremely vexed and regretful, but there was nothing he could do. He went first. Before he left, he glanced at Fan Xian and laughed bitterly. The emotions in his heart were indescribably complicated. Fan Xian understood that this crown prince still held a grudge against him for breaking up his marriage with Ruoruo. However, he couldn't do anything about it, so he could only shake his head. Outside the courtyard, there were only him and Rojia left on the stone steps. Fan Xian knew he couldn't run anymore and smiled warmly. Looking at Hongqing's figure, he said, "Your brother used to be such a refined, noble young master. How did he become like this?" Seeing him open his mouth to speak to her, Rojia's little face was filled with uncontrollable joy. She stammered, "Locked up, for too long, scolding people every day, more and more like father." Fan Xian was startled and thought that it was true. Looking at the crown prince through the crack in the door, he didn't look down on him, but he saw that he was different from other people in power. This kind of character was naturally inherited from King Jing. In the so-called struggle, one could win or lose. This was the correct way. He made a hand gesture, inviting the princess to go first. Rojia pulled at the skirt under her large red coat and lowered her head shyly as she walked slowly in front. Fan Xian followed behind her. As he walked, he examined the girl who was gradually spitting out her stamen. Looking at the soft strands of hair on her temples in the wind, his heart moved slightly. "Sister Rojia, has anything new happened in the girls' school recently?" "Brother Xian, nothing." "Sister Rojia, Brother Xian," the two of them chatted. Sister Rojia's Brother Xian came more and more smoothly. The little girl's Brother Xian never stopped. Like this, they slowly walked toward the front of the manor. Along the way they passed the cold garden, the cold path, the pavilions covered in snow, and the artificial hills covered in water. Princess Rojia walked with her head down and replied in a low voice. She couldn't resist glancing back from time to time and then turning her head as if in shock. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and quickened his steps. He walked to her side and stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Princess Rojia sensed the presence of the young man beside her and was startled. Her entire walking posture stiffened, and her fingers gripped her skirt tighter. Fan Xian smiled and said, "This world is truly strange. At the time, who would have thought that you were my cousin? Calling me Brother Xian is quite appropriate." As soon as these words came out, Princess Rojia panicked. Her small face flushed red. She didn't say anything else and just remained silent. This pair of cousins knew very well what Fan Xian meant by these words. It was written clearly in the Qing law. Given their relationship, regardless of whether or not Fan Xian had such intentions, it was still impossible. Ever since Princess Rojia saw Fan Xian for the first time when she was 12, her young girl's thoughts had all been placed on him. Regardless of whether it was under the grape trellises in the manor, in the autumn grass garden in the Fan Manor, or in the courtyard in the Tsang Mountains, she always liked to look at Fan Xian. The feelings of a young girl had not faded even after Fan Xian's marriage. Although she didn't dare ask her father, she always held on to the possibility of having 2 wives in the future. Who would have thought that such a big piece of news would explode in Jingdo one day? Brother Xian was her own cousin. From that day on, Ruojia knew this matter was impossible. However, how could 2 years of feelings fade in one day? After seeing her favorite brother Xian, she panicked again. Hearing Fan Xian say these words, she knew he was reminding her. However, Princess Ruojia was, after all, only a 14-year-old girl. Hearing Fan Xian's gentle yet serious reminder, she did not turn her head and glare at him with hidden bitterness like other noble girls in Jingdo, nor did she huff coldly. She only lowered her head even more and refused to speak. A crystal-clear teardrop fell from her long eyelashes and landed on the stone floor by her feet. Fan Xian was dumbfounded. Seeing a girl cry, he didn't know what to do. Ruojia walked forward again. Fan Xian quickly followed behind her. Along the way, Ruojia lowered her head and cried. She stubbornly bit her lip and refused to make any sound. Fan Xian felt pity, love, and anger. He was unsure of how to explain when he suddenly realized that Ruojia had stopped in her steps and turned her head to look at him seriously. Fan Xian smiled and stretched out a finger to wipe away the teardrop on the girl's face. Ruojia was still as gentle as before. She stared fixedly at Fan Xian and stammered, "Brother Xian, I beg of you something." "What is it?" "As long as I can do it," Fan Xian said seriously. "I know, it was you who thought of a way to break up Sister Ruorwo and brother's marriage." Ruojia lowered her head. Her fingers played with her skirt until countless troublesome wrinkles appeared on a corner of the light pink skirt. Fan Xian was startled. He hadn't thought that this girl would see this matter so clearly. "What is it?" Ruojia bowed slowly and said in a small voice that still retained her childish voice, "In the future, the palace will certainly appoint a marriage for Ruojia. If Ruojia is not willing, then I will have to trouble you." The marriages between the nobles and Jingdo involved too many political transactions. Fan Xian's marriage and Ruorwo's unfinished marriage were all like this. Given Princess Ruojia's status, her marriage was naturally arranged by the nobles in the palace and even personally by the Empress Dowager. Fan Xian opened his mouth wide. A moment later, he nodded his head dejectedly. He knew that he had once again been forced to carry an extremely heavy burden. The way of the world was indeed a little strange. Everyone else was matchmaking, but only he had become an expert in breaking up marriages. After Ruojia said this, she saw him nod his head again. It was as if she had used up all of the courage she had mustered earlier. Immediately, she became sad again. She looked at him deeply, turned her head, picked up her skirt, and walked quickly toward the front of the manor, no longer paying attention to Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head as he watched Princess Ruojia's figure. He watched as she lowered her head and continued to cry silently. The feeling in his heart was truly not good. He thought to himself that this girl was truly each more troublesome than the last. In the long corridor behind Taiji Palace in the royal palace, facing the tall palace walls in the distance and the winter trees at the foot of the walls. The palace was heavily guarded, particularly near the inner palace. It was strictly forbidden for anyone to make noise, and it was even more impossible for anyone to do anything too impudent. However, when the serving girls and eunuchs moving about saw the young official stretching lazily and doing leg exercises in the long corridor, not a single person dared to go up and scold him. No one dared to remind him of anything. It was impossible for a young official to enter the inner palace. If there was, then there was only one person. Only he dared to be so free and at ease in the royal palace. In the long corridor, the young official pulled back his leg from the large pillar and turned his head to look at the awkward middle-aged eunuch who wanted to laugh but didn't dare. He scolded, "What are you laughing for? This palace is so big. Naturally my legs will be sore. I don't know how you guys have such good leg skills." This young official was Fan Xian. The matter of him being the emperor's illegitimate child was known to everyone under heaven. Additionally, these years he had been favored by the emperor to the extreme. His relationship with the various nobles and eunuchs in the palace was also harmonious. He had once spent a month in the palace recovering from his injuries, so the serving girls and eunuchs were all used to his presence in the palace. Only he would have the daring to do radio calisthenics in the inner palace. Today he was accompanying Waner back to her mother's palace. As soon as they entered the palace, Waner was kept by the Empress Dowager's side. She refused to let her go. She said she wanted to keep her favorite granddaughter for the night. Fan Xian had no choice. He could only bring all kinds of gifts and walk toward the various palaces. After returning to the capital, he had walked through one. Now he had to walk through another. It was truly boring, so he took a break and rested his feet in the long corridor behind Taiji Palace. The eunuch accompanying him, holding a large pile of gift boxes, was Eunuch Dai. Hearing Fan Xian scold him, he was not shocked. On the contrary, he was happy. He laughed and said, "Sir Fan Jr. is a 9th level ace. How can servants like us compare?" In the past, Eunuch Dai had also been greatly favored by the emperor. Although he was a member of Lady Shu's palace and was in charge of the important tasks of announcing edicts to various manors, because of his relationship with his nephew and because he was involved in the struggle between Fan Xian and the second prince, he was given an idle position. Later, because of the assassination attempt in the Hanging Temple, he was forced into a corner. If he had wasted another 2 years, he would probably have died without a straw mat to cover his body with. It was all thanks to Fan Xian's endless good words on his behalf that the emperor remembered how well he had served the emperor in the past. Only then did he spare his life and let him return to the inner palace to do some idle work. For Eunuch Dai, Fan Xian was his savior and even half his master. He was even more important than Lady Shu. How could he not serve him well? The boots under Fan Xian's feet were hot. He didn't even pull them all up. Just like that, he dragged them toward the end of the long corridor. Eunuch Dai glanced at his feet and said awkwardly, "Sir, it's better to be particular in the palace." Fan Xian glanced at him and was about to tease him a bit more when he suddenly saw a few eunuchs coming from the end of the corridor. The one at the front was young and had a familiar appearance. His face was raised very high and he had an air of arrogance about him. The eunuchs behind him followed with their bodies half bent. They looked like servants of servants. "It's Eunuch Hong," Eunuch Dai reminded from behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and didn't say anything. He directly went forward. The two of them met in the middle of the corridor. Fan Xian clearly saw the few pimples on the arrogant young eunuch's face. He didn't say anything. He stood where he was and looked coldly at the other party. Hongzhu paused. He knew that Fan Xian was waiting for him to bow to him. However, he was now the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace. Furthermore, the emperor would occasionally have him go to the royal study to help out. It was even more impressive than when he held books in the royal study. Who in the palace would not respect him? Even when the court entered the palace, they were polite to him. Other than Shu the scholar, there was no official who dared to wait for him to bow first. He knew Fan Xian and knew that Fan Xian was not a normal official. Looking at Fan Xian's cold and disdainful expression, his face flushed red. He refused to lower his head first. The two of them were locked in a stalemate. The 3 or 4 eunuchs following Hongzhu were too low in rank and had never seen Fan Xian's face. How could they know that this young official was the powerful Sir Fan Jr.? Looking at this scene, they anxiously stood up for Eunuch Hong. In a sharp voice they said, "Sir, why are you wandering around in the restricted palace?" Eunuch Dai hid behind Fan Xian and snickered. He had long lost the position he once had. In the palace he was bullied badly by Hongzhu and the others. Seeing that these idiots were going to offend Fan Xian, he was unspeakably happy. He was about to say something when Fan Xian waved his hand to stop him. Fan Xian smiled slightly and looked at the eunuchs behind Hongzhu. Amused, he said, "You haven't been in the palace for long, right? There aren't many people in the palace who don't recognize me. I'm not wandering around. I'm just going to Shufang Palace to see the emperor." Indeed, it was a few eunuchs who hadn't been in the palace for long. They didn't understand the meaning in these words. They straightened their necks and said, "How dare you? Where is Shufang Palace? Why are you stopping in this long corridor? Be careful that Eunuch Hong calls the guards to throw you out." He was helping his master build up his reputation, but he had no idea that he was causing trouble for his master. As expected, Hongzhu saw the smile on Fan Xian's face become gentler and gentler. His own expression immediately changed. He was shocked, afraid, and angry. He turned his head and harshly scolded the eunuchs. Only then did he slowly bow to Fan Xian and say, "Greetings, Sir Fan Jr." Once the words Sir Fan Jr. came out, the eunuchs immediately knew they were finished. They looked at Fan Xian with faces full of fear and quickly knelt down to beg for mercy. Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to look at the eunuchs. He only stared at Hongzhu's face and mockingly said, "My father is Minister Fan, so people call me Sir Fan Jr. What kind of Eunuch Hong are you, a servant? If Eunuch Hong knew these words, he would carefully skin you." Hongzhu's face was full of fear and ruthlessness. He stared hatefully at Fan Xian and didn't say a word. "Slap yourself," Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. Hongzhu gritted his teeth and said, "I am a person of the Eastern Palace. Sir Fan Jr. is a court official. No matter what, you can't control the palace, right?" Fan Xian didn't say anything. he only looked at him coldly. Forced by those two gazes, Hongzhu had no choice but to gently slap himself in the face. After this slap landed, Eunuch Dai, who was behind Fan Xian, was overjoyed. He was going to advertise it in the royal palace that night. The eunuchs behind Hongzhu were scared half to death. They all knew of Eunuch Hong's position in the palace. They had no idea that with just one word from Sir Fan Jr., Eunuch Hong could only slap himself in the face. It looked like this Eunuch Hong was indeed not as powerful as Sir Fan Jr. Fan Xian moved his body to the side and blocked Eunuch Dai's line of sight. Taking advantage of the eunuchs kneeling on the ground, he gave Hongzhu a meaningful glance. Hongzhu saw it clearly, but his eyes were crying out, indicating that he was unable to find a convenient place to talk. Fan Xian nodded and coldly said, "Get out." Thus, Hongzhu shook out his sleeve and, angry and embarrassed, led the eunuchs toward the other end of the long corridor. Seeing this, Eunuch Dai smiled charmingly at Fan Xian and said, "Let this dog of a servant continue to be arrogant. Just because the emperor and empress both like him, he can do whatever he wants in the palace." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It is indeed not good to do whatever I want in the palace. In a moment, when I go to Shufang Palace, I still have to pay attention to my appearance." Chapter 474. In Shufang Palace, Yi Guipin was beaming with joy as she watched the two people at the desk. Fan Xian was watching Li Qingping copy a book. Not many people in the palace cared about the contents of the book. The key was in the word watch, and the key was in the teacher-student relationship between Fan Xian and Li Qingping. Yi Guipin was not a shrewd and calculative noblewoman. On the contrary, in this dark and gloomy royal palace, she had always maintained the carefree and open-mindedness of a virgin. Because of her purity and truth, she was favored by the emperor and gave birth to the third prince. Given the Qing emperor's style of not caring about the matters between men and women, after the empress gave birth to the crown prince, he probably had no plans to have more children. From this, it could be seen that Yi Guipin's personality had indeed suited the emperor's personality. Even the other people in the palace were the same. They always felt that this Guipin from the Lu family was full of energy all day, charming and lively, and made people feel comfortable just by looking at her. Like Lady Ning in the courtyard, they were both different in the royal palace. However, this difference of hers was more likable. Even though the Empress Dowager had never been very close to the third prince because of the power of the Lu family and the Fan family, she did not have any malicious words toward Yi Guipin. Everyone knew that Yi Guipin was very lenient and treated people well. She never had any thoughts of harming others. This was the result of 10 years of silence in the palace. Just because she was unwilling to scheme and had no thoughts of harming others, it did not mean that Yi Guipin truly did not have her own plans. Otherwise, she would not have used the opportunity of Fan Xian saving the third prince to have the third prince take Fan Xian as his teacher and open up all of the resources in Shufang Palace to Fan Xian. She knew Fan Xian's importance to Shufang Palace, so she always tried to win him over when there was no one around. The royal family always kept a close eye on the extended relatives, but Fan Xian had a complicated identity between the relatives, the officials, and the royal family. When Shufang Palace interacted with Fan Xian, the people in the palace could not say much. The more stable Fan Xian's position in court was, the more stable Shufang Palace's position in the emperor's heart was. Occasionally, when she thought of Fan Xian's power and the emperor's favor, Yi Guipin would always feel a bit surprised. The emperor favored his illegitimate child too much. Because of Fan Xian's great favor, it was not that Yi Guipin had not been wary of certain dangers. However, that caution could not be expressed. Thus, she remained silent and maintained a hearty and flirtatious appearance. It was not until Fan Xian returned to the clan that she truly confirmed Fan Xian's intentions. Boundless gratitude welled up from the depths of her heart. Thus, at this moment, looking at the scene of Fan Xian and her son sitting side by side at the desk, she felt incomparably happy. "I heard that you met someone in the hallway at the back of the palace." Yi Guipin's personal palace maid, Xinger, received a rumor from within the palace and hurriedly told her mistress. Yi Guipin's heart jumped. She gently beckoned Fan Xian to a side room and opened her eyes. Fan Xian rubbed his slightly sore fingers and said with a smile, "Hongzhu, that servant, is becoming more and more impudent. Seeing me he doesn't bow. Even when he walks he uses his nostrils to look at the road. I taught him a lesson on behalf of the emperor." Using his nostrils to look at the road, this description was amusing and mischievous. Yi Guipin couldn't resist laughing out loud. However, she immediately restrained her smile and quietly said, Eunuch Hong is now a popular person in the palace and the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace. Furthermore, the emperor seems to favor him and is preparing to have him return to the royal study. She glanced at Fan Xian. Everyone in the palace had, through their own channels, clearly investigated Hong Zhu's promotion and history. They all knew that Hong Zhu was serving in the royal study. Just as he was about to climb up, it was Fan Xian's secret report that caused Hong Zhu to lose his position and be chased to the Eastern Palace. Yigui Pin knew that Fan Xian and Hong Zhu did not see eye to eye, but Hong Zhu had already climbed up again in the Eastern Palace. The emperor seemed to be regretting his actions in the past. She had to remind Fan Xian that although he was not afraid of this kind of eunuch as a foreign official, he had to be on guard against the eunuchs in the palace stirring up trouble. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled coldly. How can it be so easy for such a servant who allows his brother to forcefully take over the people's property to return to the royal study? She thought for a moment and then said in a soft voice, Why bother with a servant? If he truly returns to the royal study, the hatred between the two sides will deepen. I'm afraid it will be inconvenient. Besides, there are rumors in the palace that this eunuch Hong is related to you. After all, your identity is a court official. Eunuchs in Qing Kingdom never had much status. Ever since the founding of the country, it had been strictly forbidden for eunuchs to interfere with government affairs. Light offenders would be expelled from the palace. Heavy offenders would be beaten to death on the spot. However, in the decades since the founding of the country, there had always been one or two exceptions. Old eunuch Hong, who was always resting outside Hongguang Palace, was such a special person. No one knew how many years this old eunuch had stayed in the palace. He was deeply trusted by the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. Furthermore, he was a mysterious and powerful figure. If Hong Zhu was really related to old eunuch Hong, Fan Xian would probably be wary of him. However, Fan Xian knew the reason behind this and couldn't resist smiling. He could not tell Yigui Pin, so he could only smile and say, Aunt, don't worry. I know what I'm doing. Yigui Pin saw that he did not care and couldn't resist saying a few more words of advice. Seeing that it had no effect, she angrily went into the back of the room, too lazy to continue talking to this stubborn child. Fan Xian moved closer to the third prince's table and said a few more words. He then left Shufang Palace under the third prince's reluctant gaze. 1. I was going to stay the night in the Empress Dowager's Hongguang Palace. No one knew how many days she would stay. Fan Xian and his wife entered the palace, but only one of them had to go back. Walking through the long and gloomy doorway of the Gate of Divine Marshal, he was alone. Looking at the blurry shadow behind him, he felt very unhappy. On one hand, he felt that Wan was indeed very favored in the royal family. On the other hand, he was silently cursing. That old woman only knew about the love between grandfather and granddaughter. She had never thought that he and his wife would be reunited after a long time. He walked out of the palace with a face full of displeasure. He saw the great prince looking at him with a not quite there smile. He couldn't help but say unhappily, since the founding of the country, there have not been many commanders of the imperial army and officials of the guards who have stood guard outside the royal palace every day like you. This is not the time for marching and fighting. This is a time of peace. Who are you waiting to see make a fool of yourself by standing guard outside the palace? The great prince's smile disappeared. He huffed coldly and said, What joke do you have to see? Do you think Qin will lose face if she doesn't return with you? Don't forget, my sister grew up in the palace. You seem to have long forgotten this. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, he had seen the great prince a few times. However, there were always outsiders beside him, so it was difficult to speak of personal matters. Although the two brothers had long formed an alliance that did not need to be spoken of under Qin Pingping and Lady Ning's intimate care, the great prince's position was different. He was the elder brother of all the princes. He did not want to see the crown prince and the second prince be played step by Fan Xian until they became depressed. Thus, there was still some distance between the two of them. I won't talk much with you today. I have to hurry back to the manor to do some business. Fan Xian looked at the great prince's expression and knew what this fierce general of the army and political virgin was about to say to him. He repeatedly waved his hand. The great prince scolded in a heavy voice, I don't plan on lecturing you about Qin's matter today. However, what exactly are you going to do with that woman in the north? Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he know that it was another family matter. He couldn't help smiling bitterly and saying, I say, Your Highness, this is my family matter. Since Wan has married me, there is no need for you to worry about it. At the beginning, He had been slightly jealous of the intimacy between the great prince and Wan. Now that he had the opportunity, he coldly retaliated. The great prince was furious. He forcefully suppressed his anger and said, "Who has the patience to care about you?" However, Wang Fei said that you still haven't come to my manor after the new year. She had me come to ask you if you aren't planning on coming. Wang Fei was the great princess of northern Qi that Fan Xian had personally escorted to the south. Fan Xian rubbed his head and said, "Naturally, I have to go to your manor. It will probably be the day after tomorrow." Seeing that he had agreed, the great prince nodded and didn't pay him any more attention. Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and said, "I'll also bring Hongqing." The great prince was slightly surprised and glanced at him, thinking, "Wasn't Hongqing grounded because of you?" Fan Xian didn't explain. He only furrowed his brows and said, "Speaking of which, do you still want that manor in Yangtsong Alley? She is a proper Hu tribe princess. You can't just leave her in that courtyard to rot, right?" The great prince choked and couldn't speak for a moment. Fan Xian looked at this scene and confirmed that when the Western Expedition Army was on their way back to the capital, this great prince must have had countless stories with the Hu tribe princess, Masoasua. However, it wasn't good to poke at him again. He raised his hands in a salute and climbed into the black carriage. After returning to the Fan Manor and entering the most secretive study in the triangular area of the garden, he confirmed that there were no eyes or ears around. Even the tiger guards and the servant the emperor had buried in the Fan Manor were far away from the study. Only then did Fan Xian spread his legs and lay comfortably on the low couch. He placed his feet, which were wearing pure wool socks produced by the palace treasury, toward the door of the study. He relaxed and let the steam rise, making his sore feet happy. The pair of boots was placed under the couch. The slip of paper was already in his hand. No one knew about his relationship with Hongzhu. Not even Qin Pingping and his father knew. Even Su Wenmao, who had personally handled the Yingzhou matter, did not know that he was avenging Hongzhu. He would not be able to guess in this direction. It could be said that Hongzhu was the deepest spy Fan Xian had buried in the royal palace. Because of this, the two sides did not dare to take the risk of establishing a regular intelligence system. It would be difficult for any news Hongzhu had to send out of the palace. Of course, the normal news in the royal palace was handled by a few eunuchs that Yi Pin and Fan Xian were on good terms with, so there was no need to worry about ears and eyes being blocked. Since Hongzhu had taken the risk to send him news, then this news was worth paying attention to. Furthermore, the glimmer of fear he had seen when he entered the palace before the new year made Fan Xian even more curious about the contents of this slip of paper. Fan Xian looked at the slip of paper and involuntarily narrowed his eyes. When he read to the end, he could not suppress the shock in his heart and directly sat up on the couch. When he began to read this slip of paper, he did not think much of it. He felt that Hongzhu was taking too much of a risk. As he read to the end, he finally understood the meaning hidden in Hongzhu's words. He was so frightened that he could no longer lie down. What was written on the slip of paper was very simple. The specific names of the people were also used in a secret language that Fan Xian and Hongzhu had discussed at the beginning. Fan Xian understood it very well. The opening paragraph wrote about a strange habit the crown prince had when he went to bed. He always liked to lift up the clothes of the serving girls and concubines and cover their heads, only revealing their naked lower bodies. The handwriting of the second paragraph trembled slightly. It was clear that Hongzhu was also afraid when he wrote it. It said that in the year Fan Xian had left Jingdou, the crown prince's health had gradually improved. His venereal disease seemed to have been cured. However, his habit of going to bed had not changed. Furthermore, a few times when the crown prince was drunk, he could faintly hear him call out the word "aunt" in the moment of ecstasy. If it was only limited to these two paragraphs, Fan Xian could only use this intelligence report to confirm that the crown prince had endless fantasies about the eldest princess' beautiful appearance and perfect body. Although it was slightly perverted, for Fan Xian, who had experienced countless baptisms of sex in his previous life, it was nothing. What truly scared Fan Xian so much that he jumped up from the couch was the third paragraph in Hongzhu's message. There was only one sentence. He said that in these few months, the crown prince had rarely been close to the serving girls and concubines in the eastern palace. Furthermore, he was in good spirits. It was very simple. To a normal person, the last sentence was very meaningless, but it scared Fan Xian quite a bit. Although the words on this piece of paper were taboo, in the eyes of observant people, they would still know who it was talking about. Hongzhu must have seen something or heard something, but he didn't dare write it on the paper. "Aunt?" Fan Xian paced a few times in the study. His lips were a bit dry. Finally he stopped in front of the low couch. Rubbing his hands together, he crushed the piece of paper into powder. His expression was very strange. After a long time he cursed in a low voice, "Do you think you're Yanghua?" Fan Xian was dumbfounded. He was completely dumbfounded. Although Sir Jean and Sir Zhongma had both taught him that the two dirtiest places in the world were the royal palace and the brothel, and the history of his previous life had used the words, dirty tang and stinky man, to give him some mental preparation. Now that he truly knew about the things in the palace, he, the owner of the largest brothel in Qing Kingdom, still couldn't help but stare dumbfounded and feel greatly shocked. He walked to the side of the table and picked up a cup of cold tea to drink, extinguishing the shock and sense of absurdity in his heart. With great difficulty he finally calmed down. He finally knew where Hongzhu's fear came from. Anyone who knew of such an incestuous story that could not be told to the world, their first reaction would be to be afraid of being silenced. At the same time, he also knew why the crown prince had been so calm recently and appeared to have a card up his sleeve. It turned out that he had the confidence to make the eldest princess truly abandon the second prince and turn to support him. But what if the eldest princess was playing with the crown prince's feelings? Fan Xian suddenly thought of this and immediately shook his head, giving himself a light slap. Such a big thing, what exactly was he thinking? Did he have to think for the second prince? He had to reap the most benefits from this information. However, he still couldn't help but think of the scene in Guangxin Palace. He involuntarily shivered. He was indeed uncomfortable in his heart. For one, he strangely felt that it was not worth it for the eldest princess. How could the foremost beauty in Qing Kingdom, a peerless beauty who had not shown any signs of her youth fading away, use her body as a weapon? Even though there had always been rumors in the streets that the eldest princess kept many handsome men, Fan Xian still unconsciously did not want to believe this. The second reason he was unhappy was that no matter what was said, the eldest princess was his mother-in-law. The crown prince, that little bastard, had an affair with his mother-in-law. What would happen to his father-in-law's hat in Wuzhou? What the F***ck was he? Fan Xian stood by the table with his fists tightly clenched. There was a wave of unreasonable anger in his heart. This was clearly a piece of news that he could use to make a big deal out of and directly bring down the crown prince. However, it did not make him happy at all. He kept feeling that he had been taken advantage of by the crown prince. At the same time, he was angry at Hongzhu's daring. He didn't know if the little eunuchs kneeling on the ground had seen a corner of the paper he had stepped on. If this matter got out, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to protect him. He was silent by the table for a long time. He finally shook off that absurd feeling of failure and anger. He took 2 deep breaths and decided to make good use of this shocking news. However, if he couldn't talk to Hongzhu face to face and act from inside the royal palace, it would be impossible to maximize the influence of this matter. After all, he couldn't have the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council go into the marketplace to spread rumors. The eldest princess had an affair with the crown prince? Fan Xian didn't want to risk the emperor's anger or the empress dowager's embarrassment turning into anger and investigating the Overwatch Council to throw out these rumors. He had to have the emperor or empress dowager personally discover this scandal in the palace. He made up his mind to make a good plan. At the same time, before he left the capital, he had to discuss all the details of the plan with Hongzhu and Fan Xian. When it came to plans and conspiracies, Fan Xian, who was skilled in assassination and little tricks, did not have much confidence. He immediately thought of his most capable assistant, the white-clothed young master. He immediately walked out of the study, passed through the back garden and got into the carriage. He didn't even hear the sound of the edict being announced from the front yard of the Fan Manor. The carriage drove to the Overwatch Council's gray and black square building. Fan Xian hurriedly jumped off the carriage. His leather boots stepped on the remaining snow piled on either side of Tianhe Avenue with a whoosh. As he walked into the council, there were Overwatch Council officials he bumped into along the way who bowed with faces full of shock and made way. These officials looked at the commissioner's gloomy expression and hurried footsteps. They all wondered which major figure in the capital was going to be unlucky again. Pushing open the door and entering the secret room, he was not surprised to see a young official wearing thick, plain-colored clothing sitting behind the table beside the black cloth by the window. In the entire Overwatch Council, the only person who didn't like to wear official robes and had the right not to wear official robes was the present head of the 4th Bureau, the acting representative of the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun or Sir Yan Jr. Fan Xian threw the robe he was wearing onto the chair and closed the door. Looking at the black cloth on the window, he furrowed his brows. He walked directly to the side of the window and pulled down the black cloth. The light from the sky outside and the reflection from the remaining snow immediately poured into the gloomy room, brightening it up. The sudden strengthening of the light pierced Yen Bingyun's eyes. He unconsciously raised his hand to block it. "You're not Director Qin," Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. "There's no need to always hide yourself in the dark." Yen Bingyun lowered his hand and shook his head helplessly. This piece of black cloth had been placed on the window of this secret room for many years. It had already become the Overwatch Council's most unique scenery. Who would lightly touch it? Only the commissioner would not take Director Chen's intentions to heart. Fan Xian looked at Yen Bingyun's slightly pale face and haggard expression. He couldn't help but shake his head. Qin Pingping did not care much about the present Overwatch Council. Fan Xian was also too lazy to care. Everything was piled on Yen Bingyun's shoulders. Looking at his appearance, he probably hadn't had a good night's sleep in many days. A faint apologetic feeling welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He walked to the window and narrowed his eyes at the royal palace in the distance. What exactly does the director mean by using such a black cloth to cover it? Yen Bingyun didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at the majestic royal palace in the distance and suddenly had a glimmer of doubt about his decision to come to the Overwatch Council to find Yen Bingyun. That matter involved the dignity of the royal family and the future of the Qin kingdom. Sir Yen Jr. had always placed the interests of the court as the highest standard. He turned his head and glanced at Yen Bingyun. He truly did not dare to take this risk. There are two flaws. Before, I wrote two things incorrectly. It should be that Qin Pingping is older than the emperor. Also, King Jing is older than Yunrui, just a little older. Shamelessly apologizing. As for the problem of the crown prince not entering the ranks of the princes, I said it this way in the past. As for whether or not this setting is good and reasonable, that is another matter. However, I like to play this way. There is no problem of writing the third prince and forgetting the crown prince. There are only 4 in total. I have 5 fingers and can count them all. Perhaps it is not reasonable, but I don't care. As for Li Yunrui, it was said before that Yunrui gave birth to Wan'er at 15. When the Jingdo incident happened, Yunrui was only 12 or 13. I think all young girls are pure pearls. As for the hide-and-seek that King Jing mentioned, it was a lie. Such an important matter could not be overheard by playing hide-and-seek in the royal palace. As a member of the royal family, King Jing had his own difficulties. He was the most helpless person. He only reminded Fan Xian of the Qin family matter, but he could not tell Fan Xian everything. King Jing only needed a reason to tell Fan Xian, and Fan Xian accepted this reason. A smart person would not ask too many questions. I wrote this very carefully so there should not be any problems. King Jing is not very old. Some friends say that he does not look like the old gardener. Feels wrong. That is another problem with my setting. Originally, I wanted to write about a decadent prince. His first love died early, so he indulged in sensual pleasures. He was born early and had children early. His hair turned gray early and he aged early. From this, it can be seen that men should cherish their relationships and not fall in love early. There are many flaws in the book. I will admit this, but even if I admit it, I am afraid that I will not have time to correct them. After all, this is not a thesis. I do not have the ability and energy to write every day. It is very tiring. Please understand. I am very grateful. Thank you all for reading, correcting, and understanding. After writing so much nonsense, it would be stupid not to ask for votes. Stretch out your right hand. If you love China, if you love monthly votes, please vote monthly. P.S. This paragraph does not count the number of words. P.S. This chapter was originally going to be called Shocking Secret News, but then I felt that it was too common, even though I am very common. P.S. The Philips TV in my living room that has accompanied my family for 14 years is finally broken. Does this count as me crying about being poor out of habit? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.